Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the May 10th reconvened regular assembly meeting. We are in the Mona Lisa Drexler Assembly Chambers, and it's approximately 6 o'clock. And I'd like to call this meeting to order. For the record, we have Assembly Member Andrew Gray participating telephonically tonight due to an employment-related commitment, which is allowed by our Borough Code. So, Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lojeski.
Here.
Mr. Quist.
Here.
Mr. Tacky.
Here.
Mr. Cooper.
Here.
Ms. Major.
Here.
Mr. Roberts.
Here.
Mr. Gray.
Here.
Mr. Lawrence.
Here.
And we have with us City of North Pole Rep. Ms. Heading.
Yes, she's here.
Okay. And then we have School Board Rep. Ms. Dominique.
Here.
Ms. Dodge.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Super. Thank you very much. So I'm going to give us a safety announcement so we know how to get out of here if we need to, should an emergency arise. We, of course, have the doors, the double doors we came in through. We would go straight out. We have a single door over here behind the post column, and another door here behind the column. This one go out and to your right. This one over here out and to your left. Okay, we have next an Employee of the Month proclamation. We're having a modified reconvene meeting tonight. So, Mr. Mayor, I hear that we have someone to recognize.
We absolutely do have someone to recognize. It's the fun time when we do have an Employee of the Month program where employees pick somebody in our organization that they think is an outstanding employee and providing a high level of service in our community. So I don't choose this. This is fellow employees. And we do have Bobette McCurgan with us this evening, and I'd like to read the proclamation. Whereas each month, employees of the Fairbanks North Star Borough nominate a fellow employee to be recognized as Employee of the Month, and whereas Bobette McCurgan, Administrative Assistant 3 in the Public Works Department, began her employment with the Fairbanks North Star Borough in June 2010. Whereas in her position, she is renowned for her proactive, can-do attitude, always going the extra mile in her efforts to provide the best possible service to her fellow employees. And whereas Bobette diligently strives to expand her knowledge, never hesitating to take on a diverse range of tasks and assignments. And whereas Bobette has proven herself to be an organized, motivated, dependable, and knowledgeable employee who can handle any circumstance with ease and decorum. That's the important part. The decorum part. Whereas Bobette is a strong team player who never hesitates to jump in, take on a new challenge, and assist in the successful completion of a myriad of projects and assignments. And whereas Bobette's co-workers have expressed their high regard for the positive and enthusiastic manner in which she embraces every challenge, she's a pleasure to work with. And they are proud to have her on their team. So now, therefore, I, Carl W. Kessler, the mayor, and all that good stuff, proclaim Bobette McCurgan, Employee of the Month for May 2018. Congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations, Bobette. We appreciate all of your service and your... So that takes us to Special Orders Public Hearing, Ordinance Number 2018-20, which is an ordinance appropriating funds as listed for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2018, ratifying fiscal policies and user fees, and levying taxes. The sponsor is Mayor Castle. It's on page 2 of our packet. There's a proposed substitute 2018-20. Proposed substitute attachment A, C, and D substitutes, which are on page 48. There's a Finance Committee recommendations on page 95. There'll be a test later to see if you know what page it's on. The public hearing was closed on May 3, 2018. And the motion to adopt is on the floor from May 3, 2018 by Van Lawrence and seconded by Mr. Tacky. And that's where we are. I don't believe that the substitute hasn't been moved yet. So that is where we are.
Substitute.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Lawrence to substitute the proposed substitute for, so, Mr. Lawrence, it sounded like you had something you wanted to say about that.
Well, I'd like to make a motion to amend. There's a lot of lines involved. I'm going to move the printed amendment that would increase operations of Mary Si to normal operations for the first 6 months of FY 18 and 19. Clerk, do I need to be any more detailed than that?
I'm just trying to look which one we're looking at first.
The top one.
Top one,
Is
thank
there a
you.
second, Mr. Lawrence? So, Mr. Lawrence has moved to add full-time operations at Mary Si Rec Center for 6 months. It's been seconded by Mr. Tacky. It is in the Parks and Rec Public Works Department, General Fund, in the Division of Recreation, Parks Maintenance, Facilities Maintenance. Revenue, page 41, Parks and Rec, pages 476 to 477, 494 to 499, and Public Works, pages 524 to 531. The dollar amount is $201,300. A net with $5,760 in revenue, a net increase of $195,540. On the proposed amendment, Mr. Roberts is up first.
So I would speak against this. This only funds Mary Si for 6 months with an estimated closure of December. And even if we get a bond issue, and even if the voters approve that bond issue, it will take much longer than that to put something into operation. I would ask the Assembly to vote this down, and then we can bring up an amendment to restore full-time operations for the next fiscal year for Mary Si, which of course will be subject to Assembly action in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments on the proposed amendment, Mr. Lawrence?
Well, my point is that this will be subject to the next assembly in the future, and for that reason, if the condition of the building proves to be better than what I suspect it is, then next year's assembly can by ordinance, extend the hours or extend the time period for the operations of Mary Si all the way, for the final 6 months of the fiscal year. But, I think that can wait until we know more about the condition of the building.
Mr. Gray, I'm just going to take an opportunity to see if you have anything you wish to say.
Not at the moment, thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments or debate on this amendment? Thank you, Mr. Tacky.
I'm just going to second what Mr. Lawrence has just pointed out. This way we're only increasing our budget at the moment by $195,000 versus like $375,000 about. And then we can actually spend the money to actually get a full report on the building and either increase the appropriations for Mary Si later on, or if we find out that, yeah, we are going to need to demolish the building, and we've already made that position. So I'm voting in favor of this one.
Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, I want to make sure everyone understands that my intention with this ordinance is that with the amendment that I would like, which isn't this amendment, is to fund it out of the general fund, out of the money that we have in savings. And so it wouldn't impact this year's budget in the same way. Thanks.
Any other discussion on the amendment? I'm going to pass the gavel so that I can speak to this amendment.
All right, Ms. Dodge?
Thank you. I think Mary Si Rec Center, I'm going to say a little more since I don't usually get to say anything. I think Mary Si Rec Center fills an important niche in our community. It's important to our seniors, it's important to our disabled people, it's important to people that are rehabbing from injuries or surgery, and to young families. We've had extensive testimony about how Mary Si Rec Center is equipped with handrails, stairs, ramps, a lift. It's very specialized. It is not a run-of-the-mill pool or facility. I found it compelling that Juneau kept their Mary Si Recreation Center type facility open along with their new aquatic center. I feel we have put the cart before the horse here. We need we need additional information on the condition of the building, as well as how the voters feel about the aquatic center come this fall. I support funding a full year's funding so we can gather this information, make an informed decision, and the users and the employees can have certainty. I support a minimum of funding through next April or May so users and staff can at least have use of this facility through the winter as we, absent three of us, make this decision next year. I urge you to vote no on this amendment and vote yes on the full-time operations. Thank you. Okay, you might say something. Yes, Mr. Quist and then Mr. Cooper.
Thank you. So I just kind of a question on order. Mr. Roberts has an amendment that that if we were to want to consider it, we would have to defeat this, or if this were to pass, would he be able to make his motion? I guess my question is, they seem like they're the same item in a way. I mean, would it be appropriate if we were to be considering that to make a motion to amend the amendment?
You could certainly amend this amendment to, yes, you could amend the amendment. If you wanted to amend it to some other amendment on our table or something
Okay,
else.
well, thank you. I'm not going to make a motion this
Okay,
time. But
thank you. Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. Well, I think that both the 6-month and the 1-year option have valid points. I think it could actually, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other, right? You could wait 6 months, and if it looks like we needed to put more money towards it, we do so at that time. If we funded Mary Saya for another full fiscal year, if 3 months into it, it looked like the reports came back and it just wasn't feasible to keep it going, then we reappropriate that money back in. So, it's 6 of one, half dozen of the other. That said, I think that, I agree with Mr. Lawrence. We don't have the answers that we need yet on some of the studies that we asked for, and we have to put something back in because tonight's the night we have to make the decision on the budgets and, see how it goes forward.
Thank you. I have Ms. Major and then Mr. Roberts.
So I agree with Mr. Cooper, and it's kind of 6 one, half dozen the other. The one challenge or the one concern that I have with it is I'm not a fan of incremental funding, and I think when you get into incremental funding, it oftentimes ends up costing you more in the long run, and it certainly creates a lot of uncertainty. So with that, I am in favor of the full year and then the ability to reappropriate as time goes on, vice just the 6 months, and then bringing this back to the table.
Mr. Roberts.
So, something you need to think about when you're looking at 6 months is that, yes, the Assembly can make the decision then, but it's the administration who has all the numbers at their tips, who's going to have to actually do the work of putting all that together, which could be requested by an Assembly member. But you're going to have a new mayor at that point. And so you're putting a brand-new mayor on the spot here to ramp up something right after he takes office if we're going to have it on our agenda by the December timeframe. And that's already tight because we have one meeting in November, one in December, and something can go wrong with a lack of a quorum or a bad notice, and suddenly you end up having to close the facility because you didn't put enough funding into it. So I speak against 6 months, and since it was mentioned that I do have the ability to put forward an amendment, I will go ahead and amend this amendment by adding to the budget motion that's labeled to add full-time operations at Mary Sy Rec Center, which has a net increase of $374,130, and it's to reinstate full-time normal operations at Mary Sy for the FY19 in the FY19 operating budget.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Seconded by Mr. Lejeski. Do you want to speak to this, or do you?
I think I've said everything, but realize, just so the public understands, that on the table right now is the funding for the FY19 year for Mary Saya in full. And once we get done, because this is amendment to the amendment, I can't add any more to it, which maybe I should have just included that when I was doing it. But I have an intent to put some intent language in to have the administration know that our intent is to operate it for a full year, because there'll be a new mayor, and we don't know who's coming in and what they're looking at things, but we want to make sure they know the Assembly's intent with this.
Thank you. And so, just for the record, what we have in front of us is an amendment to the amendment that increases the dollar amount to $385,660, a net increase of $374,130, and a net increase in revenues of $11,530. On the amendment to the amendment, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, I oppose the amendment to the amendment, not strongly. I mean, Mr. Cooper's got it right. The decision's going to be, the final decision on this is going to be made, probably after I'm off the Assembly and he's off and Ms. Dodge is off, and when we have a new mayor. I think that decision's going to have to be made there. But I'd rather have a decision made in November or December as to how much to operate Mary Si, simply because we'll know more then than we know now. And, obviously this budget is such that we're going to be using savings to operate Mary Si, whether it's 6 months or a year, and I just would rather see us budget for 6 months so that the next Assembly and the next mayor can revisit the operations, what is the reasonable amount of operations for the building.
Okay. Anything else on the amendment to the amendment? Yes, Mr. Wojciechowski.
Well, I'm just wondering where this puts us, because the one thing that's coming up is the report that I believe the mayor is going forward with, the seismic analysis, and there might be something else there. So is this all irrelevant if Mary Si comes back as seismically unsound?
It could be, yeah. I mean, if we lose occupancy rating for the building, it closes, and, I mean, then we're stuck. Yeah, so we're moving ahead on getting that information for you as quickly as we can. There's a walkthrough tomorrow afternoon. I don't remember the exact schedule. I believe it's tomorrow afternoon. We're walkthrough with contractors and such. We're out for RFP to do the research on that. There's 3 critical factors in the building that we need to go, sort of 4 actually, but anyway, that we need to review per your request, and we're doing that as quickly as we can. I don't know exactly when we'll have an answer. It depends on response from the contractors on our RFP that's on the street now.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts and then Mr. Cooper.
Yeah, I want to point out that if this amendment to the amendment passes, I will then offer one to fund this out of general fund. So if it gets shut down, then it never impacted the taxpayers directly, and all that money stays in the general fund.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. I was just actually going to make Mr. Roberts' point that I think the place that it would come from is a general fund balance, and if everything fell apart and we had to close the building, we'd just appropriate the money back to the fund balance. So.
Anything else on the amendment, Mr. Wojciechowski?
Yeah, I understand what you guys are saying. It makes perfect sense. So, in effect, this gives us the option of keeping Mary Si open, or I guess the certainty that we have if the report comes back clean enough. But big picture, I'm kind of thinking of what the mayor will probably have to chime in. I'm trying to read your mind a little bit and what you're thinking, because I'm somewhat thinking the same thing anyway. That is the overall picture here. I think it's fair enough to say that the overall budget's going to be unsustainable, largely because of the capital end of things. And so we absolutely can save Mary Si for a time if the reports come back okay, but we're, in a certain extent, kicking the can down the road, or at least diminishing our resources we have to address the other building problems that we have in the borough. I don't know that I've got much more to say about that, but I just wanted to make sure it's on the top of everyone's mind before we start voting on these.
Okay. Anything else on the amendment to the amendment? Mr. Cooper.
I just, in response to Mr. Wojciechowski, I completely agree. It's that we have finite resources, and how we spend those resources on our various buildings is a big part of the problem here. I think that I wanted to make one point, and it was something I think that Ms. Rosser sent in an email today, which was give us time to figure out how we can have a solution, right? And so I think we've got a very active, passionate group of people here who've expressed a lot of interest in finding ways to make this work going forward. And I think that we're going to be looking for your help in making this work too, because we certainly don't have all the resources in the world to make that happen. That's one of the great things about Fairbanks. A lot of people who care about a lot of things, right? And I think from my perspective too, through this process, we've learned a lot about the process. And as we deal with these difficult questions with more difficult buildings that need maintenance, like the Big Dipper, who are going to have a lot of passionate hockey players, and everybody has something in Fairbanks that they love, right? Anybody who's lived here, grown up here, loves something. There's something really special about Fairbanks, and those things get old and they fall apart, and not unlike me and some of us, right? And so we're going to have to figure out how to deal with that as a community. And I think that this process here with Mary Saya as the first attempt to tackle this problem has been challenging and a little bit painful at times, but we've learned, and we're just going to have to keep tackling it. So, thanks.
Okay. Anything else on the amendment to the amendment? Seeing none, clerk, please call the roll, and it won't carry the main motion, or the main amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Lojewski,
Yes.
Ms. Major,
Yes.
Mr. Roberts,
Yes?
Mr. Gray,
Yes.
Mr. Tacky,
Yes.
Mr. Quist,
Yes.
Mr. Cooper,
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence,
No.
Ms. Dodge.
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
8-1.
And I can't see you there, Mr. Gray. I'm presuming you'll let me know if you need to change your vote.
I will.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Roberts, you had your hand up.
Yes, so I'd like to amend this motion before us so that the funding for this motion is provided out of the general fund. And
I think it's already says general fund.
is that, you believe that that's included? I see, because it says general fund up there. Can we get clarification from finance that they take this amendment to mean that?
For the listening public, we all have and for this public, we have an amendment in front of us, and it shows the source of funds, and that's what we're talking about.
So typically, at the end of all your motions, we ask how you want to balance the budget, which could be from fund balance, could be from changing some, like facilities maintenance reserve contribution, or so if you specifically want this to come from general fund balance, you should move that and vote on that.
So I will move that then, for this to come out of general fund, and I can speak to why if I get a second.
Okay?
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr.
Second.
Roberts and seconded by Mr. Cooper that this be specifically drawn from general fund on the motion?
So every year, I've always made a general fund motion to fund, of course, at a level to keep the mill rate the same. And then there's funding that the mayor's requested, which I believe his intent was for us to fund out of general fund whatever we ended up over the budget that he brought forward. So that's another level. And then there's complexity in that as far as I wouldn't want this to fail because that motion failed at the end. I want this to stand on its own, and then everything else will still have that same motion, but it'll be separate from the Mary Saya debate. And so everyone can vote on that, not voting on Mary Saya at that point in time. They're voting on it now.
Okay. Any other discussion on the proposed amendment to the amendment to specifically draw this from general fund? See, yes, Mr. Lawrence.
Is this an amendment to the amendment?
This is an amendment to the amendment.
To the
So
one-year amendment? Or,
Yeah, to the one-year amendment. That's correct. The 1 year that was just adopted.
we voted on that, so it was
We voted to
adopted.
make it the amendment
Okay, I see. All right.
that we're considering. I know. Becomes challenging. We could use a little scoreboard. So we are on the amendment to the amendment. Any further discussion? Mr. Gray?
No?
Okey-doke. Thank you. Yes, Mr. Lojewski.
So we're about, 1.8 million-ish above the target reserve? I don't know what other people had plans for that 1.8 million, what they wanted to do with it. Just curious.
Well, we probably won't get that answer, but we can at least find out how much above the target we were. That answer might come later after we finish with the amendment.
I just realized I don't have the most current one. I don't have your actions from the April meetings. I apologize. I'll look it up online and get you an answer.
Thank you.
I was going to,
Yes, Mr. Cooper.
I don't know if this helps, Ms. Brady. We received a updated fund balance report today.
Right.
It's the one.
It's $25,194,307.
It's a little over 2.
And the target reserve amount is $23,040,799.
Okay, thank you. Anything else on the proposed amendment to the amendment? Seeing none, clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes?
Mr. Lojeski?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
9-0.
thank you. Mr. Gray, I'm assuming that you'll tell me if you want to.
Of course.
Okay. So that takes us back to the amendment as amended. Mr. Roberts.
So, had passed out a piece of paper with an intent statement on there. I move to attach this intent statement to attachment D under Parks and Recreation, and it says, "It is the intent of the Assembly that the administration operate the Mary Sire Recreation Center facility for the FY19 year unless an alternative is approved by the Assembly."
There a second to Mr. Roberts' proposed intent statement?
Second.
Thank you. Seconded by Mr. Lojeski. Thank you. So it's been moved and seconded that we add an intent statement that it is the intent of the Assembly that the administration operate the Mary Sire Recreation Center facility for the FY19 year unless an alternative is approved by the Assembly. Mr. Roberts, on the anything
Yes.
else you wish to add?
So this is really, while this mayor knows our intent is he's sitting in this room, we'll have a new one come this fall, and we want to make sure that this is on paper and publicly known that the intent of the Assembly in putting this money in was that it would keep operating, since it would be possible to put the money in and then still have it not operated. So that's all this is.
Thank you. Any other? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, the wording, unless an alternative is approved by the Assembly, what if the tests that are going to be conducted for the next few weeks show that the building is dangerous and not occupied, should not be occupied? Are you suggesting that it's our intent that they keep operating throughout the entire fiscal year anyway?
No. My intent is that the Assembly would then take action, and so they might call a special meeting. Hopefully, they actually get these tests done before the end of this fiscal year, and so it might change before you even hit this amendment coming into effect, because right now it's funded through June. And in fact, this amendment is only for the FY19 year, so if he got these tests and found something catastrophic before the end of June, then this wouldn't tie the administration's hands. In fact, it's intent language, and technically, I'm not sure it ties their hands anyway, but I wanted to put it out there.
Well,
Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
I don't know, well, assuming that the administration is at least somewhat bound by the intent language, how does it, simply because this intent language becomes undoable if tests show that the building shouldn't be occupied, how does that solve the problem? The intent language is still going to be in the budget.
So, okay, I guess I might be missing what you're saying, because the Assembly can take action, but I would also point out that there are emergency situations in life that happen that you can intend a lot of things. If the city said you have to shut down because their building inspector said it had to happen, then there wouldn't be much choice in the matter anyway. And I don't think that this would override something like that, but the attorney could speak to that.
Yeah, that's correct. Frankly, the intent statement and even the funds don't require that the facility be operated. I mean, the administration could decide it is going to close at certain days of the week, things like that. I mean, those are typically not legislative matters, they're administrative matters.
Mr. Mayor.
Yeah, I have absolutely every intent of doing just what you are requesting to do. So we will give it our best faith effort to operate the facility, and that's fine. We will do that. And if something comes up that's an issue from any of these reports, if it's a small issue, we can chat about it. And if it's a major, if the city inspector does pull our occupancy rating, we'll, depending on whether or not he gives us any time, we'll keep it open as long as we possibly can, and I'll come back to you with information as quickly as it's available.
Any other questions or discussion on the, yes, Mr. Quist?
Thank you. I'm curious as to why this is really necessary. I mean, it seems to me that if we adopt the amendment, as we've already amended it, and then adopt the budget, including funding to operate the facility in FY19, to me, I mean, that is a stronger statement than an intent statement. And I would like to think that the administration, when assemblies a budget money in a certain way, see that as an intent for that money to be used in that way. So, I mean, I don't disagree with the message, but I don't see that it's particularly necessary, so I won't be voting for it.
Okay, anything else on the proposed amendment to the amendment? Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, I think it's important that not just the administration, but the public knows our intent, and that they know this passed, and if a future administrator decides to go down a different path, that they'll have something to bring up about what our intent was, and I'm sure the attorneys will bring it up with them too, and finance and all that. But I wanted to get this out there publicly that this is what we're doing, and but again, making sure that the assembly can change their mind if they find out something needs to be done in the future.
Okay. Are we ready to vote on the amendment to the amendment that adopts the intent statement that has been proposed by Mr. Roberts? I think we're ready, Clerk.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Wojciechowski?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes?
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
7-0.
We are back.
7-2.
Thank you. We are back to the amendment as amended. Anything else on this amendment? Or are we ready to vote on it? Clerk, we look, oh, Mr. Wojciechowski.
Well, I just wonder where we're going to be at 12 months from now. I don't want to see the same thing repeat itself and have everyone, all the Mary Sia users coming out and say, hey, we're on the chopping block, save us again. I don't know exactly what the solution is. I've brought it up before. I kind of would love to see a nonprofit come in and take the facility over and run it. But if this happens every year, that's not right for anybody. And I don't know if others have thoughts on it that they would like to share, but I am thinking about what's happening in 12 months from now with Mary Sia.
Anybody else on the amendment? Mr. Gray?
No.
Okay, thank you. Clerk, I think
Not a
we're...
vote.
Okay, very good. I'm glad you clarified that. Clerk, please call the roll on the amendment as amended. Yes, yes,
What is the
Mr.?
amendment?
The amendment has taken this, the amendment would fund Mary Sia Rec Center for 1 year at full operations. It would specify that it comes from general fund, and it would have the intent language that it is the intent of the Assembly, the administration, operate Mary Sia Rec Center for the fiscal year 19, unless an alternative is approved by the Assembly. So that's the amendment as amended in front of us. Thank you. Clerk, please call the roll.
Thank you, Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Wojciechowski?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes?
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
9-0.
the Mary Sia Rec Center is funded for another year unanimously. Okay. Does anyone have, and Mr. Roberts?
So, another sheet in front of you. I am moving to amend substitute attachment D intent statements to change the intent of the multi-year and capital projects budget code enforcement cleanup project to limit the funds used to vehicle cleanups to read as follows. It is the intent of the FNSB Assembly that the code enforcement cleanup project is to finance vehicle cleanups when voluntary compliance efforts, including issuance of citations, have been ineffective to include encroachment and abandoned vehicle removal. So I am removing the words property and the words and cleanups have been ordered by the court. And I can speak to that if I get a second.
Second.
I'm just give me a minute while I mark it up, okay? So you're removing property, you're inserting vehicle, and you're removing and cleanups have been, there's another copy
It's in our-
somewhere.
yep.
Thank you. So it's been moved by Mr. Roberts and seconded by Mr. Majewski to amend substitute attachment D intent statements to change the intent of the multi-year and capital projects budget code, thank you, enforcement project cleanup, to limit the funds used to vehicle cleanups to read as follows. It is the intent of the Fairbanks North Star Borough Assembly that the code enforcement cleanup project is to finance vehicle cleanups when voluntary compliance efforts, including the issuance of citations, have been ineffective, to include encroachment and abandoned vehicle removal. You wish to speak to that, Mr. Roberts?
Yes. So this cleanup project fund came up in the assembly meeting for 100,000, which was then reduced to 20, and it was stated a large part of the intent was that since we started with a resolution a year or two ago, increasing the amount of enforcement against properties called junkyards and those kind of zoning enforcement projects, that they wanted to be able to clean up a property if the time came when they've moved through the court system and to be able to do it. And then also they mentioned that they wanted to be able to remove cars from public right-of-ways, that they were able to do it, and maybe some other vehicle cleanups that people dump a vehicle on borough property or something like that. So obviously with this amendment, I'm saying I have no problem with the vehicle cleanups. Property is a much larger issue. I was talking to Mr. Satley. There's an often spoke about thing that happened 20, 30 years ago when we went after a junkyard owner, and the borough went all the way through this long process, went all the way through the court system, got permission to go clean up his property, to take his property, basically, you're taking his property. Now, it turns out, what I didn't realize, I was talking to Mr. Satley today about this to get more of the details because he'd sent an email that referenced some of them a few weeks ago. And it turns out it wasn't general use property that this was. So it actually was legal to have a junkyard there. But his only problem was he didn't have a fence, which kind of goes beyond zoning. You can't be grandfathered for not having a fence, basically. So he's required to put a fence up, but he wouldn't do that. Now, one thing I was thinking about with that is just, maybe it's cheaper sometimes to put a fence up than it is to clean all the property off. I don't know. But just thinking about how you spend that money, he was talking about the decisions the assembly had to make, that they were approached with this deal that, we were going to try to clean it up and we're going to try to bill them through the PFD, or we go to try to do a garnishment, and we try to eventually recover that money over many years, it seemed like. And so they were presented with this, the assembly, and the assembly didn't want to go through this very complex process, unsure of what would actually result and if we'd ever see any money back. So it wasn't just about spending money, which is what's often brought up, is how the assembly didn't want to spend the money. It's much more complex than that when the assembly was faced with it 30 years ago. They had a lot of different questions on it, and he was bringing up these concerns to me. And I'm bringing all that up just to make the point that these properties can be complex, and especially with our very broad definition of junkyards that we have in code that hasn't been looked at since the 80s. When this assembly passed the resolution saying we want more enforcement, they talked about how we would revisit code and make sure that we're enforcing what we want to enforce, that The code is where we want it. But that's never been done with junkyards. But yet that's the one we're getting the most complaints and we're looking at doing action on. What would happen is if we put this fund in and some more money got in there, enough to actually fund a cleanup, which would be more than the 20,000 in it, is that could all be done without the assembly ever knowing about it. The one possible notice they might get is that the attorney might inform us when we go into court to take the owner to court. We'd just get a notice of that. But otherwise, we'd find out about all the property being taken when we read about it in the paper. So the assembly would be giving up their discretion in that case and their responsibility to evaluate those facts with these cases. So what I think needs to happen, the proper procedure, is if somebody wants to do this and create a fund for this purpose, for the purpose of the property cleanups, they need to bring an ordinance forward. Right now, this fund has no parameters. That intent, which I'm modifying a little, that's it. There's no rules on this fund, even like where the money goes back, or that maybe the money we recover from the owner after a court case goes back in the cleanup fund. There's no rules here except our own standard rules for handling funds. So we need to have some consideration of that. And I would see in that ordinance that you'd at least want a memorandum to the assembly that this is going to happen, that somebody could pull off the consent agenda if it was on there and talk about it during a meeting and have a discussion and get the facts from the administration. So it's not just happening. We are responsible for knowing what's going on. And in the almost 6 years I've been on the assembly, it's always saddened me when I find out about something by reading it in the paper or somebody calling me that I should have known about. And this administration's been very good at trying to inform us ahead of time. But we've had plenty of those cases where we've found out after the fact about things. So I don't think that the assembly should jump into abdicating the responsibility. But what this is about is the process involved with that. If somebody wants to do this and do a property cleanup, which it kind of seemed like the majority assembly wanted to do, they should bring forth an ordinance that lays out the parameters needed. And maybe we should also bring forth something to look at the junkyard code to make sure it's where we want it before we go down this road. This is a major road. Most people don't understand how little amount of property on your property makes you a junkyard in this town. There's a lot of people who would qualify. I'm not going to mention any names, but I'm just saying, there's a lot of people out there. And so we need to be very careful. We're going to have a new administration. We don't know what direction that's going to go. And the assembly should be responsible to put good parameters in there. So for now, I just want to take this cleanup fund, make it about vehicles, and the assembly can modify it later or create a different fund, but they can put some parameters on it and bring that forward at a later date. We'll have public hearing on it. We can have a big discussion because that's the way we should be doing things. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Mr. Cooper, Mr. Tacky, and then Mr. Lawrence.
Question for Ms. Dolan. Before the borough tried to get a court order to enforce a citation or some kind of injunction to remove property, would you need assembly approval to do that, or would you be able to do that on your own?
No, so the way Title I works, we don't give more than 2 citations in a calendar year, and after 2, then they're supposed to refer it to legal for different action, which would be the filing of an injunction. Actually, your code doesn't require me to notify you. It requires the mayor to notify you of non-routine litigation. So we could file, and then the mayor could notify you, but we would get our authority from the administration before filing.
Right, and so that would be a situation where the administration would notify us, but we wouldn't necessarily approve it.
Correct.
Okay. I guess, and if I comment, I think that I understand where Mr. Roberts is going here, but I think that property is the right thing to be cleaning up because we're actually taking the car off the property and hauling it away. So we're cleaning up the property, not the vehicle. I like having court orders in there because it's actually more due process to have a court say that you got to remove it than even just us. And I guess the thing I wouldn't be opposed to would be adding language in that says after approval by the assembly or something like that. So I guess I'd speak against the amendment in its current form, but would be opening to adding some language that gave the assembly more authority. Ms. Dahl?
Yeah.
So I just want to clarify that when Mr. Roberts asked for language here, he wanted to limit the code enforcement cleanups to vehicles only. Mm-hmm. And so under Title 12 encroachments and Title 10 abandoned vehicles, we would give due process. We would give notice of the vehicle unless there was some serious hazard. but we wouldn't typically go get a court order before we handle that. That's not the process that's currently in code. So I think the difference is if we're talking code enforcement generally and we're talking property cleanups under Title 18, or if we're talking vehicle only. So it had previously been drafted, my understanding was it was code enforcement generally, which was going to include Title 18 code enforcement, such as junkyards. So this would restrict this, in my opinion, to strictly Title 10 and Title 12, because that's the only place that we do abandoned vehicle and encroachment removal. So we don't go get court orders before we would do that. We have a different legal process that we follow.
I guess I was looking at the language that Mr. Roberts proposes to remove in parentheses or brackets, and cleanups have been ordered by the court. I've reviewed that as both requirements having had to have been met before the funds could be used for cleanup. So not only would they have to, citations been ineffective, but a court order had been issued by the court before we could use the fund.
So that would be the case if we were doing it as the code enforcement cleanup of property. So in other words, we're going on someone else's property, we would go get a court order before we do that. But if he's limiting this to encroachment and abandoned vehicle removal, we wouldn't be going and getting court orders first. Those requirements in our code are basically you're within 10 feet of a travel roadway or you're interfering with the proper use of a roadway. So we have due process and notice requirements that we have to give, but a court order wouldn't be part of our procedure.
Yep.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, I have Mr. Tacky, then Mr. Lawrence, then Ms. Major.
I'm speaking against the amendment as well, and it was pretty much directly along the same lines as what Mr. Cooper was just about to point out, or had just pointed out. It feels a little interesting that it would be cleaning up property before having a court order, but after hearing Ms. Dolan, I'm good.
Okay, Mr. Lawrence and then Ms. Major.
You know, I would remind this assembly that this is a legislative body, and this legislative body in the past has passed code, passed ordinances prohibiting junkyards and defining junkyards. And, you know, just for the record, a junkyard means the use of more than 1,000 square feet of a lot or parcels under common ownership for a salvage operation, including but not limited to the storage or sale of junk or the collection, dismantlement, storage, or salvage of junk. I don't know if we need to work on that definition or not, but the point is, our role is to provide for rules as to how people can use their property, and it's up to the executive branch, up to the administration to enforce those rules. That's not what we're called to do. We've done so with junkyards, or this is, you know, prior assemblies have, and we can always change the definition if we feel like it. But, you know, I would point out that of all the complaints about property use that are lodged with this borough, 80% of them are junkyards. I mean, that's by far the biggest problem in the eyes of the members of this community. It's junkyards. And to not address dealing with them, I think is irresponsible and counter to what you know, what the people want and what the law says. Now, this morning I got a call from a constituent who lives next to the junkyard that we're talking about, that was litigated 20 years ago and went all the way to the Supreme Court. The borough prevailed. They had every right to clean, to remove the junk from the owner's property. According to Ms. Dolan, the neighbors had offered to contribute $15,000 to help with the cleanup costs, and we're looking to the borough to pay the balance, which is about $15,000 more. And the assembly voted no, which, you know, I don't get, but I know that this constituent I talked to today has been looking at that junkyard for 20 years, and he's had it. He's totally fed up with it. And so, you know, I certainly strongly vote against this amendment. I think it was a mistake not to leave $100,000 in this fund, because we need to address junkyards. We really do. It's the biggest property, land use problem in the borough by far.
I have Ms. Major, Mr. Roberts, and Mr. Mayor.
So I guess my question is really whether it's for Ms. Dolan or for the mayor. My concern would be removal of the term property and replace it with the term vehicle, and whether or not that would restrict then if other legitimate items need to be removed that might be of a significant size or stature that if that would, if this intent language would prevent that from happening, and then whether or not also included would be any, ground contamination or any, environmental, if it's a vehicle that's leaked, if this is just restricted to vehicles, then would it limit the ability to do some additional cleanup that might be necessary?
So to answer your first part, we would take the intent statement as this is how this fund is supposed to be used, and it would be limited to vehicles. As to the second part, this fund was never, I don't think, intended to do the environmental cleanup. It's not really our role. Our code doesn't require those types of things, so that would be a DEC type function, not ours.
So if you saw a big oil leak or something under when the vehicle was picked up, then that would just go to a different altogether process.
Correct, we wouldn't do that cleanup.
Okay, thank you.
I have Mr. Roberts and then Mr. Mayor.
So, couple members were talking about the vehicle cleanups, and it almost sounded like they thought that we would be going onto other people's properties to take these off. And we might if their property happens to be next to a right-of-way, I mean, if it's right next to it. But, and the attorney can correct me here, but I don't think this language here, I don't think our code allows us to go onto property, not counting when we're dealing with the right-of-way issue, and take a vehicle off that property, even if it's a junk vehicle. That would come under the junkyard ordinances if it qualified with 1,000 square foot, which isn't hard to get to with vehicles. And so, unless the attorney says that I'm looking at it wrong, I'm thinking this only means vehicles that are interfering in the right-of-way or they're abandoned vehicles on our property. That's what, in my head, I was thinking of, and so if the attorney wants to clarify if there's anything more.
No, I think you're correct.
All right. So I just want to make sure that that was clear, because it didn't sound like from some of the statements that people realize that. So I guess what I'll say is that doing all this in this little intent paragraph, creating this whole fund, it's not the right way to do. It's a sloppy way to do something of such impact. We're taking people's property and livelihood. Some people have got some heavy equipment lying around that people consider junk. Okay? I mean, I went to Alaska Land yesterday. I walked through Alaska Land, showing my wife all the old pieces of equipment there. Technically, those are junk. Okay? I like them being there, and I'm not going to complain. But some people have that kind of junk around in Fairbanks, and we're the kind of place that has that. And we just want to be careful about that. It's really a major thing that I don't think the Assembly would want to give up their responsibility in this and have to answer to the public saying, why did you just take all my 55 Corvette collection or whatever? So,
Yes, Ms. Dolan and then Mr. Mayor.
If I could just clarify that, and I'm not weighing for or against this, I view this as a policy call, but the Assembly passed a resolution intending that a code enforcement program commence, and they expressed an intent to fund that program. So we have, through your legislative powers, we have code that we had not been enforcing. And so there was a policy decision made of, instead of repealing code, to commit to enforcing it. And so just so we're clear on what my office is going to do if there isn't funding and there isn't support for code enforcement is we will again limit our code enforcement program. So we're not going to go get court orders and expend borough resources and taxpayer resources if this body doesn't want us to. But then we really need to take a look at code and actually take it off the books, because your code is law. And so right now you have laws that we aren't actively enforcing.
right. And all I'm saying is that if the Assembly wants that, that it should be brought forth with a few more parameters on how that's used so that we can answer the public about its use and what's going on. And, well, I had one other point I can't remember at the moment. So.
Okay. We'll come back. Mr. Mayor.
So the attorney covered quite a bit of what I was going to say here. The Assembly asked us to get more engaged in this, and I said we'd need to have a fund and some money, and that was the intent. So I brought back essentially what the Assembly was asking for. We don't take this sort of thing lightly as far as going out and enforcing these kinds of codes, and I think it's being characterized as we might be somewhat frivolous and just go out and take somebody's property, and we don't do that. The process starts with at least a warning from code enforcement without a citation, just a chat with the owner. Typically, it's more than one, and the owner of the property has the opportunity to call me and say, hey, wait a second, your code enforcement officer's mistaken here, or there's extenuating circumstances, and we do our best to work with people. The citation process starts when a homeowner who's clearly in violation tells us they're not going to do anything about it and not work with us. And then we go to the citation process. A citation can be appealed, and they can take that to court. Then we have to do a second citation, and that can be appealed, and that can go to court. And then if we're still on this trail after all of that, then we go to court and have the judge decide whether or not we can do this. So, it's already a four-step process, and we're not going to invest that time, money, and energy in something if, as it happened in the case that you're referencing from a few years back, if it dead ends there, we don't have the resources to waste our time, money, and energy. And so you guys decide if you want the codes enforced, we'll do it. But you need to commit to that. And if you don't, if you think we need to change them, that's your prerogative too, and we'll do as per directed here. But this mixed message is very challenging for us to try to enforce and do something about. And it's been going on for a long time. And that's why we haven't been enforcing the codes. So I hope you can send a clear message with where you want us to go with this. Thank you.
I have Mr. Tackey, then Mr. Cooper, then Mr. Roberts.
Well, I obviously want my intent to be clear that I want us to enforce our rules. That's how I voted for the resolution. I'm a little dismayed by the mischaracterization that Mr. Roberts puts forth that we're going to come out and steal people's property after the fact that there has to be a court order that we have right here. It says, and cleanups have been ordered by the court. That means the judicial branch has weighed in on this and the fact that you haven't followed the zoning codes of your community in which you chose to live. So I am definitely voting against this amendment, and I would urge the rest of this assembly to do so if you voted for the resolution that we had passed earlier this year.
Mr. Cooper, then
Thanks,
Mr.
I think
Roberts.
Mr. Tackey stole all of my points. As one of the proponents of the resolution setting a priority for code enforcement, obviously I think that, and I said it then and I'll say it now, either we enforce the code that we have or we take that code off the books. I mean, there's no sense in having code that we don't enforce or don't follow. It creates a lot more problems than not having it in the first place, I guess. So I agree with the mayor. We have to, if we're going to take the position that we're going to enforce the code we have to have the funds to do that. And then I just, Mr. Roberts made a clarifying point that this isn't going onto people's property and taking their property. This is cleaning up stuff that's in an encroachment or in a right-of-way or on abandoned on borough property, and then made an impassioned argument about taking stuff that was on people's property. So I just want to be clear that this is, if you leave your car in the middle of the road and it's blocking the ability of a fire truck to go down, I absolutely think we should put resources to getting that car out of the way. If you abandon property someplace it's not supposed to be, we absolutely should spend resources to get it out of the way. So I don't support the amendment at this point.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts.
So the point that I'd forgotten before is I just wanted to clarify what I think Mr. Lawrence meant, and that is when he's talking 80% of complaints, which I don't know if that's the number, but I would take that for the sake of argument because I can't remember what the number is, but that would be of Title 18 complaints. code enforcement. I'm sure that doesn't include animal control and all the other enforcement type complaints. But so I would point out that this isn't about whether or not we should enforce the junkyard code. Okay, everyone, I talked at length when we did the resolution about the problems with the junkyard code, and Mr. Sadley's talked a lot about that and given a lot of testimony on that. But that's not what this is about. This is about how does the assembly do its business? What kind of oversight are we doing? How are we setting up something that's so monumental? You're talking destroying people's lives when you take their property. For some people, and we've had the witnesses here, that's their asset. That's what they've got. They've got that heavy equipment, and that's all they have that's worth something. And they could maybe sell that someday and get the money they need in their retirement years when they're not using that equipment anymore. It is a taking, and because you're not paying them for their property, you're taking it and they get nothing. Okay, so yeah, sure, the court ordered it, but that doesn't make it not a taking. Okay, you take their property and they get nothing. But what I'm doing with this amendment is taking it down to vehicles that are encroaching, getting in people's way, not on their own property. The junkyard ordinance is about property on your property. And I'm saying we shouldn't go in there without the assembly at least knowing about it and being able to say, no, there's something going on here, and being able to get testimony, like if we had a memo on the agenda or something. But otherwise, all we're going to get is maybe the guy will send us an angry email, or maybe we'll read about it in the paper. It's just not the right way to do this, to on the fly set up this fund, which was done as an amendment to the budget. It didn't even come in the budget. It was amended into the budget as we went. So if you believe in code enforcement, which is not what this amendment's about, then bring up an ordinance later to create this fund with the right parameters so that we're doing government right, and we're just not throwing something out there like mud on the wall, hoping it'll stick because we want this end result. Sure, you want the end result. We all want everyone to have these nice clean yards. I sure wish I could do better on mine, but I work at it. We all want that, but how do you achieve that? There's a right way and a wrong way, and just throwing it to administrator, which is going to change out in 6 months. We have no idea who's coming along and saying, we're going to totally trust you to just handle this, and because we don't want to touch it anymore. We created the code, you go deal with it. We should never be that hands-off. We should always have some skin in the game, and we should always be paying attention, even if that skin in the game is just our time, because we're having to take the energy to have public hearing on the issue, or even have it on the consent agenda so people can come testify on it. Thanks.
Okay, I don't have anyone else on my list. Mr. Quist.
Thank you. I'd speak against this amendment, and I feel like the amendment sponsor is conflating these two issues again of the issue of having vehicles in a public right-of-way versus the issue of junk on somebody's private property, and the two distinctly different processes. And there's a strong implication, or I'm sure Mr. Roberts will correct me if I'm misunderstanding, but I'm getting the implication that we're somehow, if we don't adopt this amendment, we're somehow endorsing the taking of private property from private citizens off of their own private property without due process. And I feel that that's a mischaracterization. Thank you.
I think, Mr. Gray, is your hand raised? He's sending me, he's trying to let me
No.
know. Okay, thank you.
My points have been thoroughly made. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lawrence's hand is raised then.
Well, with regards to junkyards, and this assembly really hasn't, I haven't dealt with the issue that I can recall all that much, but first of all, junkyards are prohibited in certain zones, residential zones. I think they're totally prohibited, but elsewhere, they're allowed as long as there's a screen, as long as there's a fence that will prevent, that will obscure the personal property from neighbors. And so we're talking about a property, if we have to cite and then take a property owner to court to get an injunction requiring them to remove the property or allowing the borough to do so, we're talking about a person who refused to put up a fence. And I don't really have much sympathy for that. If they're in the business of selling junk, then have them put up a fence. That's all it takes. That's what the code requires, is putting up a fence. We're talking about the people who don't want to put up a fence.
Mr. Mayor, was that a hand raise or a head scratch?
Oh,
Okay.
head scratch.
Thank you. Anybody else on this proposed amendment to the intent language? Seeing none, clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Lojewski?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
2-7.
it fails 2-7. Mr. Quist?
I'd like to make an amendment. Appendix E, user fee schedule, page 757, library services. I'd like to move to delete practice piano fee.
So Mr. Quist has moved to change Appendix E, user fee schedule, page 757, delete practice piano fee. Is there a second?
What's the amount of the fee?
What is the amount of the fee he would like to know?
It's as
$50
as
or-
proposed by the administration, 15. I believe that it remained unamended in the end after Finance Committee.
Is there a second?
I will second it for the sake of discussion.
For the listening audience and those of you in the room, we spent an hour and a half on this?
48 minutes.
48 minutes earlier, but apparently we have another few to spend.
Thank you for allowing me to make the motion. I appreciate it. I think this is important enough that we can at least spend a few more
Absolutely.
minutes discussing it. As was mentioned, we had a very robust discussion on this in Finance Committee. And so just, I'll briefly sum up for everybody else who's not as close to this as we are. The administration has proposed in the FY19 budget a couple of changes to user fees and library services, one of which is to add a $15 fee for use of the practice piano, which is in the conference room there. There's currently no fee for its use. It gets used a couple of times a day. We talked about amending it out or amending it down. So the reason I'm making this motion is, because, I mean, it was pretty clearly established that this $15 fee is going to basically prohibit the use of the practice piano by the vast majority of the people who do use it. And it's not going to really increase revenue to the borough that much, because we also learned that there's a significant cost with collecting this type of fee that's like somewhere in the ballpark of like $7 or $10. So we are otherwise in the same budget increasing the fee to rent that same room. So if you wanted to reserve that room to like lock down your practice time, you could do that, and that would cost you $25. What I'm proposing is, that stays, but the practice piano fee itself goes away, so that if the room's not otherwise being used, that somebody can use the piano without having to pay the $15 fee. One thing that you won't see on your schedule here, but you might recall from Finance Committee, we did amend to include language that said specifically if somebody has paid to reserve the room, they don't then need to pay on top of that to reserve the piano. So, I mean, just to sum up, I feel like this fee is so high that you might as well not have a practice piano there. And the ideal solution would be to find ways to charge smaller amounts of money that are more appropriate to this. If you look at our other fees, I mean, it just doesn't make sense when you can rent a pool for $30, including lifeguards, but you have to pay like $15 to use a piano. Anyways, so that's it. Just moving to delete it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, and please, I want to be clear, my comment was certainly not meant to demean the importance of having this conversation. And for the Assembly members and public, this is on page 82 of our packet, substitute attachment C, user fee schedule. And is there any other discussion, Mr. On deleting the piano practice fee? Okay, I don't see any. Clerk, sounds like we must be ready to vote.
Thank you. Mr. Tacky?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Lojewski?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
3-6.
the proposed amendment fails 3-6. Any other? Yes, Mr. Quist.
I'd like to make another motion, if I may. The clerk distributed it a minute ago. I would like to move this for the solid waste disposal division budget. I'd like to move to amend on pages 559 to 567 by reinstating all proposed decreases with, quote, solid waste efficiencies and cost savings reductions listed in column T, which decreases line 14 by 60,200, line 15 by 25,760, line 19 by $69,960, line 20 by 37,780, line 21 by 16,150, line 22 by 7,070, line 32 by 73,300, line 60 by 31,000, line 62 by 18,000, line 66 by 20,000, and line 77 by $106,000 for a total decrease of $465,220, and to allow the Financial Services Department to make any changes necessary to reflect the intent of reinstating all lines with, quote, solid waste efficiencies and cost savings reductions.
Okay, so
Second.
Mr. Quist has moved and Mr. Gray has seconded to amend back in the solid waste disposal division budget monies that were removed, that were essentially closing. He wants to add it back in, and this would result in the closure of the transfer sites and the dump on Sunday and Monday, I presume.
Yeah, I could speak to this.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Quist.
So, thank you for the second, Mr. Gray. So what I'm proposing is that we amend back in, so we had a lengthy discussion in Finance Committee about this as well, came out of that 5-4. I don't imagine that changing, but I think this is a great idea, and I think that this is a good venue for it as well. It's a more public venue than our Finance Committee. So what this would do is it would, this is for solid waste division, so this is for the dump. So this has like a kind of a ripple effect to the transfer stations, but is this motion's limited to solid waste, and what it would do is change the budgeting so that the solid waste collection would be on a 5-day schedule. The memo we have a memo dated from the 1st from the administration that kind of goes into this into more detail that we had requested in our Finance Committee meeting. As a result of the 5-day schedule at the dump, there are quite a bit of savings, which are detailed here and we've heard about. And then for and then again, for those who might not be as familiar with this as us, so then as a result of the dump being on a 5-day schedule, that would limit the ability for the transfer sites to be open, and would result in what's proposed in a 6-day schedule at the transfer sites, like a Monday through Saturday schedule. We've talked about it a lot more in the memo. I think explains it very well. So that's all I have at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. I have Mr. Roberts, Mr. Tackey, Mr. Cooper, and Mr. Lawrence. Mr. Roberts.
Yeah, Mr. Quist explained it somewhat. I just want to make sure the public understands that what we're talking about is because of shutting down the landfill a couple days, we would shut the transfer sites down a couple days approximately. And so you're looking, they were mostly talking Sunday and Monday, shutting down the transfer sites. So you wouldn't be able to take your trash anywhere on those days. And so that's what we're talking about here. And I feel that since that's the most used service the borough does, almost 100% of the people use that service, and with schedules out there, that people need those days at the transfer station to be able to dump their trash. And I don't think that this is the right alternative to cut that out, at least for the weekends. And that was the big answer. So that's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Tackey, and then Mr. Cooper, and then Mr. Lawrence.
I'm just going to say the same thing I said before in the Finance Committee. It seems kind of like not the best place to try and find savings when it's only $465,000 out of like a $12 million budget. To spend that extra amount to keep the services open for 7 days rather than for 5 days, and to keep the landfill or the transfer sites open 7 days instead of 6 or 5 days. I was definitely in favor of spending the extra dollars to keep that service open all the time, as it's all used by all community members in some fashion.
Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. And Mr. Roberts filled in some of the details. I think the other piece that's worth filling in is that this affects the tipping fee rate. So that's the number that gets adjusted. It goes up by $4 versus $2. $2 if we found the efficiencies, $4 if we leave the budget as now. And then my second question was, I didn't know if the administration wanted to give a nutshell description of this particular proposal, or if we all have enough of an understanding. I thought it might be helpful for the public to hear the administration's perspective on this.
Well, there's cost savings created in the tipping fee. If this was to pass, we'd have to adjust the tipping fee down a couple dollars, which we can do. So there's a cost savings there on this. It is only $500,000 in savings. It makes the landfill more efficient and saves us money there, and it saves us a little bit of money at transfer sites. It would close them on Sundays, and Monday during the day they'd be open Monday evening if this went through. So you're losing a day and a half of transfer site usage. Sunday is by far the slowest day, which is why staff picked that as the day to be closed. And it's a modest savings. It's $500,000, but we were looking for savings everywhere, and it's, I guess, more of a savings than we just added on Mary Sy, pays for Mary Sy.
Thank you, Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, I'm glad to see Mr. Jordan here. My recollection is that more than $465,000 was going to be saved with this proposal, and I may be wrong, but we're talking about the solid waste disposal division saving $465,220. But does that, if nothing else, there's savings at the landfill if we're going to only operate the landfill 5 days a week. That means that the cover will only have to be applied 5 instead of 7 times a week, right? Which saves space in the landfill. So that adds life to the particular sale of that landfill, which is fairly expensive to develop. So, I mean, and that savings isn't reflected in this $465,000 savings in the budget, is it?
That's correct. It is not reflected.
My understanding is that you, as, you know, as the, you're not a director, but, you know, as the head guy for the landfill, you have to, at this point, hire people to work 7 days a week, right? And obviously, given the wage and hour laws, it's not in the interest of this borough to have people work more than 5 days at 8 hours a day. Otherwise, we're paying overtime, right?
We have staff currently that is on each member has different work schedules. So they still work a 5-day schedule with 2 days off in a general sense, but those staffing are spread out over the 7 days.
Does that staffing over 7 days mean that you have more temporaries, more turnover than you otherwise would?
That's correct. In order for us to have a 7-day schedule in the summertime, which is more of a busier time of year, we hire additional help, not only with laborers as well as equipment operators. And it also, in order for us to have a 7-day schedule, we need a half-time waste station attendant, which is a permanent position currently, but with this cost-saving proposal, that would be eliminated. In addition, we would be eliminating one full-time equipment operator as well.
All right, well, I'm going to speak in favor of this amendment. I'm a resident of the city. My garbage is picked up 1 day a week. You know, if I don't get it out in front of my house Monday morning or Sunday night, then I get to hold on to it for another week. I really think that the people in this community are more capable than the 5 members who voted against this idea, more capable of adjusting their schedules and their lives to not dumping garbage, being able to dump garbage every day of the week. I think they can adjust and adapt to not having the transfer sites being available on Sundays and Mondays, you know, presumably till 4 or 5. It's all the examples we heard about people dumping their trash at the gate when it was shut was only because they did not have a warning that the schedule was not, that it would not be open at that time. If people know ahead of time that the transfer sites are not going to be open, such as what's happening now with the summer schedule, Mr. Jordan, are you seeing a lot of people dump garbage at the gate, you know, when, you know, between 7 p.m. and 7 a.m.?
In terms of the number, of the overall people that use the transfer sites, the number that's actually leaving some debris in front of the bins or in front of the gates is pretty small. I don't have an exact number. We are getting a few smaller piles, you know, at various sites.
Okay, and I'm guessing based upon, well, from last year, did that problem go away after people got used to the hours?
Last year, we had less issues with people putting in their garbage or leaving their garbage in front of the gates, but this year we have more sites under the attendant services, so you sort of anticipate a few more occurrences. I would hope and think with time that would decrease. I know there's a Alaska State Trooper on one instance, he actually left me a message. He identified who had left the debris, called him, and gave him a choice: please come back and pick up your debris, or either he would issue him a citation. Person elected to come back and pick up their debris. It's just disappointing, you know. Someone throws their trash on the ground in front of a public facility.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah, I speak in favor of this amendment. I think I think we're shortchanging the people of this community, thinking that they have to have access to transfer sites 7 days a week. I think they can adjust to fewer, and it's saving us $500,000 at least. So, I speak in favor.
Mr. Gray, thank you for waiting patiently. Over to you.
Not a problem. So I agree a lot with what Mr. Cooper said. I mostly seconded this amendment because we discussed it a lot in Finance Committee, obviously, but I wanted the public to be able to hear a little bit more the members' perspectives and also the administration's perspectives. And, I feel like the public is already pretty mad at us for the whole 7 to 7 crash issue. I'm not sure that my perspective has changed on this specific one about putting it down to 5 days or leaving it at 7. But it's interesting to be in the position of the public being mad at you for not providing enough service versus something where you're trying to provide cost savings and then you get somebody mad at you anyway. So that's a tough position to be in, but I just wanted to, I don't think I've changed my perspective per se. I think that this is a service that people are used to. I think it's something that's essential. I don't know that, I don't know that I've changed my perspective, but I've been kind of torn on this. So glad to discuss it again.
Thank you. And, I'm going to pass the gavel because I, too, appreciate you bringing this forward, Mr. Quist. I feel that this was inappropriate to do in a budget session. I feel that we should have an ordinance. The public should know that we're proposing closing the sites 2 days a week. We should have a discussion. We should listen to it. I've heard people say yes and no as I've wandered around saying, well, what do you think about this? So and I also have been told of some cost savings that we can find by using the coal ash that the various utilities are working to rid themselves of. They say that it's a very good substitute for the gravel. So there's some other ways we can save some money that we should probably pursue. Thank you.
All right. Any other debate? Mr. Quist.
Thank you. One of the reasons that I think that this is a good place to look, and the argument that was made this is a reason not to touch it, is that everybody uses this. I mean, we're at a place where we need to be, like, everybody needs to be sharing in the cost of government. Everybody needs to be sharing in the reduction of service. And so I think that this is an appropriate measure. And like I said at the beginning, I don't necessarily expect the outcome to change based on how things went in Finance Committee. But I'd like to make a motion to amend the amendment that I probably should have included in the initial, which is also on page 766, to adjust the tipping fee rate from $111 a ton to $109, and then all the fees that roll down off of that as well, from the $4 increase to the $2 increase. And I think that budgetarily, these two concepts are really linked. So that's why I'm offering that amendment to the amendment.
Okay, we have a second to amend the amendment to also provide that the user fees or the tipping fees will be decreased if this amendment passes. Discussion. All right, Mr. Gray, I know you have something to say, but I think unless it addresses this amendment to the amendment, I'm going to call for a vote on the amendment to the amendment.
That's fine.
All right. Madam Clerk?
Thank you. Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Lojeski?
Yes.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote?
9-0.
All right. All right. Well, then, back to the amendment as amended. Mr. Gray, did you have, you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, just something I forgot to bring up before. We were talking about, the worry of piles of trash outside the transfer station. I happened to see somebody that I know well today say that they tried to go to the Esther transfer site this morning, and it was after 7, and the gates were still locked, and there was a pile of garbage and brush in front of the gate. So I hope that if we've made these changes to the hours, that we're at least going to be diligent about and considerate about people's time, that they can expect to go there during those hours and get in and dump their trash, because this person actually had to drive to a different transfer site.
All right, Ms. Dodge.
And Mr. Tacky has his hand up too. I just wanted to mention the other thing that we discovered when we discussed this last time was that there were indeed many contracts that would need to be changed, that Eielson probably needs to renegotiate contracts, Fort Wainwright needs to renegotiate contracts, City needs to renegotiate contracts, and we need to renegotiate contracts. So I think this is not a simple thing. I urge you voting no, and I encourage the administration to bring this back as an ordinance so we can fully discuss it appropriately. Thank you.
Mr. Tacky.
I obviously associate myself closely with those statements. Strongly urge everyone to vote no. I don't think this has been fleshed out enough, especially like the same deal with the hours and affecting people without them knowing about it. I too have already driven by when I was coming back from the Turtle Club. I noticed that the Farmers Loop one had trash outside of it as well. And so I know we have like cost savings associated with all this, but I haven't heard, like I didn't really ask. I guess I could ask Mr. Jordan right now, is there, given the fact that we generate the same amount of trash, regardless the number of days, is it already analyzed that you can handle the taking in of that amount of tonnage in a shorter window each day, and actually like compacting it and filling it with the savings that you've projected with 8-hour days for employees?
So the short answer is yes. I mean, I've looked at from the staffing standpoint. Would I have enough staffing members each day of those 5 days per week to handle the various areas that need to be covered, scale house, front office, operators, technicians, and so forth. I think I've allowed for 7 or 7.5 on an average basis each day of the week of operators. Also, I've looked at it from an equipment standpoint. Can the various compactors, dozers, are they have the capacity to handle a larger amount of tonnage? And the answer is yes as well. There's a range for each compactor. There's a CAT handbook that you can look at that will tell you what it can handle, and we're well within that range. Things like other contracts, gravel usage, things like that can be adjusted as needed. So hopefully that addressed your question there.
Yeah, that covers it for me.
Ms. Major.
So I just want to say that I'm torn on this one because I really recognize and see the value in both arguments. One, it's almost $500,000 in cost savings, and I agree that if we make these changes, people would change their behavior. I mean, it's very common in other cities that places where you want to get rid of your trash or other items they're not open 7 days a week. So I get that, but I also agree with Ms. Dodge that this probably deserves a little bit more open process with public input and truly recognizing the impact of those who use the facilities, particularly our businesses. So I'm still a little undecided on how I'm going to vote on this one because I think there's very valid arguments on both sides.
Mr. Roberts?
I would say that if this is brought forward an ordinance, that we also want to talk to the city about exactly what their arrangements are and what they can do within their agreements and what's possible for them. It seemed like there were kind of assumptions made on that part, and I think we really need to know is they're pretty affected, but also the other large users. There was a whole list given to us in the Finance Committee, and I appreciated that, and we need to make sure that everyone's able to handle that kind of a shift.
All right. Any further discussion? Mr. Wojcicki.
Well, I'm just kind of reiterating a couple of comments from last time, and this is more, I guess, for the public and to remind myself, but we can save $500,000 on this, but don't think that frees up $500,000 for Mary Saya or whatever else in the budget. It's its own special color of money, so those savings will filter down to us individually in various different pieces, but it'll basically add $500,000 to to our pockets one way or another. If you chase the money, and I'm not exactly sure how it filters down. I don't know if the attorney could help me within the city. So if they have a lower tipping rate, how does that filter down into people's pockets? I know for the borough residents, it'll go into eventually lower tax rates, theoretically.
I don't know other than to say the city charges a fee for garbage collection, so I assume they would adjust their fee accordingly, but
So that fee potentially might not go up as much as it otherwise would have or go down, whatever the case is.
Correct. That would be my assumption, but I don't know.
So anyway, I'll be voting the same way I was in the finance committee. To me, it's no big deal whatsoever to lose 2 days. I do also echo some of the statements of some of the other members where I haven't heard from the public on it, though. I certainly could be swayed if a whole bunch of the community came out and said, all right, I want you to interrupt me. It looks like you have.
The public has had no information that this was something to comment on because it came on a Saturday afternoon at 3 o'clock in a budget. That's my whole point.
Yeah, so I agree with that, and I'd like to hear from the public, but I'm still voting yes. So that's me.
All right, further comment, debate, questions? Mr. Roberts?
I'd like to ask finance a question, which I don't know if you can pull up off the top of your head, but can you recollect when the last time was that we didn't raise the transfer collection enterprise fund? I can't remember the exact name of it. The one that pays the tipping fees for the borough residents. It seems like we always go to the max, and we're saving up to eventually redo the transfer sites. So have we ever, since I've been here, it seems like we've always maxed it. Have we ever not maxed it in recent years, or?
I'm going to partly defer to Peggy. In the years that I've been in this position, which is since 2013, we've always taken it to the cap. I don't know if Peggy knows beyond that.
I might have to defer to Bob, but I recollect that we've always gone to the cap with the solid waste collection district.
Okay, so my point would be then for the public is that the city residents would get an offset in an increase of their trash fees. In other words, it wouldn't be raised quite as soon because they had lower tipping fees that applied to them this year, and so they might not raise their tipping fee, their trash collection fee for the residences as soon. They might be able to extend out how far they can go an extra year without raising those fees. But the borough residents, if we keep taking the solid waste collection district to the max, all it means is that we're just going to accumulate a little bit less money in the transfer site collection fund, the fund that the transfer sites are based out of, but that's not going to go to anyone's pocket directly. It just means in the future we'll have a little bit less money and have to put off when we use that money. That's all it means. And then there's some other very large commercial or governmental agencies that use it that might have some other impacts because of those tipping fees.
All right, further debate. Mr. Gray, anything more?
No, I'm good, thank you.
Okay, I think we're ready to vote on this amendment. Madam Clerk?
As amended, Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Tackey?
No.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Lojeski?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
No.
And Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ask them if they want to.
Okay, does anyone want to change their vote?
5-4?
Yes.
Passes.
Somebody,
Ms.
Major wants to change her vote.
Ms. Major, do you want to? Okay, Ms. Major?
Yes, I want to change my vote to no.
All right. Any other changes in vote? All right, Ms. Clerk, Madam Clerk.
Okay, 1, 2, 3. Looks like 4-5.
All right, the amendment as amended fails. I'm going to hand back the gavel to Ms. Dodge.
Thank you. Okay. Looks like we're still good. Do you want to take a break or do you want to move on? I don't see anybody rushing for the doors, so Mr. Cooper.
I'm going to offer an amendment that I promised I would earlier, back in the Finance Committee. So I'm going to move to amend, and you have a copy in your packet, in the Department of Community Planning, Division of Administration, page 168, line number 27, to increase the training budget for Community Planning Department and Administration Division by $15,000.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Lejeski to increase community planning by $15,000 on line 27, training increase. Mr. Cooper, on the motion.
Sure. So this year, as part of the budget process, each of the departments had kind of a list of things that they would really like to have if they could. Community planning fell very early in the process, and at that point, I think we were being a little more careful in terms of our funding. Not that being careful is a bad thing, but I think at the end of the day, all community planning had asked for was some additional training, and we had not funded that. So I was bringing this budget amendment forward now to give them some additional training dollars.
Mr. Lawrence.
Mr. Cooper, do you know specifically what kind of training or any idea?
You know, I don't recollect. I remember it had to do with some of the planning commission members. I don't know if the administration can remind us on what some of the specific trainings were, but.
Right, so the training requested by the community planning department was for just general professional development for staff and commissioners.
All right, well, I support this amendment, and I will be voting for it.
Anyone else on this amendment? Seeing none, clerk, looks like we're ready.
Mr. Lojewski?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
6-3.
it's adopted 6-3. Mr. Tacky.
I'm going to move to amend line 41 on page 551.
Is this another one of,
Yeah, it's the Public Works Solid Waste Collection District attendance.
oh,
They're removing it.
is there, do you have one of these, or is it a different?
It's on the cuff.
Pardon me?
That was off the cuff.
Okay.
What is it?
So tell us again, please.
On page 551, Public Works Solid Waste Collection District. Line 41.
Okay, hold on. Let us all get to 551.
Second.
So 551, line 41. You wanted to amend it to
0.
0?
Previously attempted to before, and then we amended it to 200 in the finance.
Right, okay. And it was seconded by Mr. Lojewski. So the proposal is that on page 551, item P, it would be zeroed from, I think it's sitting at 200,000 right now, and you would zero that, that is
Yes.
correct? Okay, would you like to speak to that?
Absolutely, yeah. I think after talking to several constituents and people that have come and attended and gone to these transfer sites and used them, they feel that seeing an attendant just pretty much standing there, kind of like being a deterrent, is like putting money in a fireplace, is what they basically have told me. And I feel that limiting the hours to 12 hours a day and the cost of cleaning up for a few errant things is not as expensive as $200,000 for having someone be there for 12 hours a day. And if we're going to like limit the hours, I'm wondering if that's the case because it's only through October 31st is all that we're paying for attendance for. So are we going to like open it back up to being 24 hours a day then after that? So come November, will we always have that available then? And so we're flipping and flopping on our constituents, and we're limiting the hours in the summertime of all the places to limit hours at. Seems a little not like a good idea, basically. So that's kind of my position, and I feel that we could just leave it wide open.
Okay. Mr. Roberts.
So, it's funny, actually, when the announcement came out that the attendance service had started, I guess I got a little upset because I thought we voted against that, but I got confused with the prior amendment in that we didn't want it closing extra days. We hadn't really talked about hours, and so I realized that because I was trying to get an amendment prepared and realized, oh, we really talked about days. We didn't talk about hours, and the Assembly pretty much approved this money. I don't like the idea of cutting the hours down, and I agree just having attendants standing around just watching things isn't really an effective use of labor, and maybe something different could be looked at, but I don't think we need to spend the money for it, and I really would like the hours, especially in the summer, extended. So I'll be voting for this amendment.
Mr. Lawrence and then Mr. Cooper.
Well, it's, okay, as I understand it, then this amendment would eliminate all attendance at all transfer sites?
That's my intention.
Okay.
FY19.
Yeah, exactly.
FY19.
June 30th.
All right, well, I speak against the amendment. I think Mr. Jordan can confirm that my recollection is that there are savings associated with that attendant being there. And I think we have to be a little more realistic here. We've got some bad behavior going on at transfer sites. We have dumpster divers who go in and pull out garbage. They cut open bags. They leave it there. We got city people who don't know better, utilizing transfer sites when they don't pay for them. And, you know, it's my impression, and Mr. Jordan, I'm going to ask you to respond to this, is that there's significant savings having an attendant there. Otherwise, we have to pay the contractor a lot more money to clean up around the dumpsters. And that, you know, in a sense, this amendment isn't going to save us money. It's probably just going to make us pay more to the contractors who have to clean up. Mr. Jordan, are there savings associated with having an attendant there?
Yes, there are, if the attendant can be effective and do the various duties that we've asked them to do. The big numbers or the big savings comes from ensuring that only the legitimate users of the transfer sites are actually using the transfer sites. Mr. Lawrence, you mentioned commercial use. That's a large number. It's been estimated about 10% of the waste stream, as well as the City of Fairbanks residents, which has been estimated about 3% of the waste stream that's being brought to the transfer sites. That in itself is a large number, and I don't have it in front of me right here. The other savings comes from the lack or the almost complete elimination of junk vehicles that are left at transfer sites. Over the course of last summer when we were doing the trial periods, I think I'm safe to say we had none, as opposed to it's before we had quite a few more. The mess that's often caused or is done at night and then left for the contractor to clean up goes away completely. Okay. Yes, there's a little bit left in front of the gates at times, but nothing compared to what's out in the site itself. Not only next to the dumpster, but 20 and 30 and 40 feet out. I've shown you pictures, I've provided photos, and I continue to get those, you know, prior to when we restarting the attendance this spring. It would save on, the hauling contract has a cleanup requirement. It's the incidental stuff that falls out of the container or whatever to clean it up. This just gets far beyond that. It's everywhere. It's the graffiti on the bins, on the containers. I went back and looked. We repainted all the bins at a number of sites last summer, and then I looked later at those that had received the attendant service and those that had not received the attendant service. Big difference. Chena Pump, I think literally every dumpster needs to get repainted. It's $60 a pop just to do that. We had times prior to these attendant services that the contractor would repaint a bin to get the graffiti off and come back the next morning and have to do it again. So $60 each time that's happening. So the attendant service has been in place for a week. It's a new contract. It's a major step up from what we were doing last summer. Last summer was 3 sites. We phased it in over the course of the summertime. This year we did it at 7, sort of all at once. There's some kinks, there's some problems we're working through. I'm constantly, in contact with the contractor. But I remind myself is some of the problems that are coming up is things we can work through. I've got the contractor has 7 new employees at these sites. Some of them are walking out there for the first time, and it is quite a daunting task to handle, having been out there myself last summer. If you want to remember how a site that was run well with an attendant service, that would be back last June when I had one of my employees out there. She was good. And if any of you have ran into her out there, she did a very good job. She was busy and she was very tired at the end of the day. The attendants from the security services this year, they'll get there, okay? I mean, there's a few stories I've heard that are not what I want to hear. They're not meeting the contract requirements, but overall they are. Was mentioned Esther transfer site. Yes, it had garbage in front this morning. I was notified by the contractor shortly after 7. What I was told is the attendant pulled the debris out of the way and got that site open. So if it wasn't open at 7, it was open shortly after. But that wasn't the fault of the attendant. It was just a matter of getting the debris out of the way.
So did your question been answered?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, did you want to speak on this topic, or you can wait? Okay. Mr. Cooper is next. I'm sorry.
Thanks. Well, I strongly oppose this amendment. I think that contrary to the constituents Mr. Tackey has heard from, the overwhelming number of constituents I have heard from has said this is one of the most positive things that the borough has done in terms of solid waste transfer site service in a number of years. Over the course of the winter, I took pictures of some of the absolutely disgusting status of the transfer sites that we didn't have last summer when people were there monitoring the sites. I mean, it was bad enough going in on my way to work at the Farmers Loop West transfer site that I stopped to actually take pictures. And that was a stark contrast to what it looked like during the summer when we did have the attendance. And, I used the two probably busiest transfer sites at both ends of Farmers Loop on a several times a week. I was going to say multi-week basis, but it's every week, several times a week. And I had to adjust again. I was going to take my trash to the transfer site, and it was 7:30. And I said, but I made the adjustment. I got there the next day. And it was a breath of fresh air to drive into that place and not have it filthy with piles of junk just lying around everywhere without, with having attendants when I was there who were actually stopping to talk to people. So I guess they were doing good when I happened to be there. I appreciated the new signage that was up. I think that this is, I wish there was a way that we could do it during the winter too. Let me put it that. So I strongly oppose this proposed amendment to zero out the funding for attendance.
Mr. Tackey, and then Mr. Mayor, and then Mr. Roberts.
So then, I guess my question for Mr. Jordan, so after October 31st, it goes back to being a 24-hour service in the middle of winter?
At this point, there's no definite decisions been made, but at this point, because the current contract would end, yes. But that could be a question we can ask the Assembly for guidance on that in the future.
But if we did want it, then theoretically, the idea is to hopefully have it 7 to 7 and there always be an attendant year-round, then eventually, if this is the direction.
I would say realistically, it's probably more likely we would ask for attendant services just in the summer months. I just can't quite figure out how I could have an attendant out there in the middle of January. It'd be a little bit cold and difficult and dark. So I think it's probably more of a seasonal type of.
How much is a car removal? How much does it cost to remove a car?
Anywhere from $40 to about $60, depending on the transfer site.
How many have you had before we ever did the attendance? What's the number of cars that we had to remove from transfer sites in a year?
I might have that, but you have to just give me a moment. Okay. So, fiscal year 16, so I'll go back a year before we started the attendant services. From the transfer sites, we had 74.
Okay.
But in fiscal year 17, and yes, there was approximately a month where we had attendant services at one site, Farmers Loop East, we had 143.
Okay. We're looking at less than $10,000 a year to remove cars. But we're wanting to spend $200,000 a year, which the original number was $312. Let me remind the Assembly that the assumptions of what our cost savings were happen to match up exactly with what our attendance would have cost. So it makes me suspect on what the actual cost savings will be achieved from having attendance there. Would the number of the the percentage that we would be saving, have tweaked had you put in $200,000 after we did that to just be a $200,000 savings, in which we would still be a wash just to have the attendance here. Because these are all theoretical assumptions, and our biggest savings are actually the idea that, oh yeah, residents are going to like totally be honest with these attendants, and not just city residents, I mean, when I say that, or commercial people that are operating vehicles that look like they came from a residence rather than from a commercial facility. The assumptions there, I think, are overly stated, and I think the savings aren't going to be as drastic as we might think they're going to be. And I think that the actual cost that you had mentioned, I figured you use $60 a car, 175 cars is $10,000. I mean, that's not even close to being 200 grand to pay for an attendant. And also, on top of that, the other thing was like painting dumpsters, you know, $60 a pop you mentioned. If we had to do 30 of them a week, every week, that we're looking at, you know, 90 grand or something. So I think that the cost of the attendance is more costly to our community than the savings that we say that we're going to be getting. And I think it's, and we're also limiting the services in the summer months of all times, when like someone, if they are expecting to come there at 7 o'clock in the morning and the thing's closed and they're not able to get in, like what are you going to do? It's like if I drove my pickup and I'm going into town, yeah, they went to another transfer site, which obviously isn't the best thing to do, because then you're now imposing another community's burden for their transfer site. But I think a lot of people are going to leave their trash in their pickups or in the back. And what likes trash more than anything is ravens in parking lots. I think it's going to make our community more dirty than just letting them put it in a specific spot during 24 hours of summer, because I know I work at 10, 11 o'clock at night mowing my lawn, and it's nice to go and drop that off.
And Mr. Roberts and then Mr. Lejeski.
So, I'd like to ask Mr. Jordan, does the, I don't want to call it revenue, but does the offset to the cleaning costs that we should be experiencing because the contractors aren't cleaning, is that, and maybe even the dumpster painting, is that reflected in the budget under some contractual services line that's been decreased because it went along with this line to hire attendants? So have we seen the corresponding offset on the measurable, quantifiable savings that you're talking about? That because we can measure that. We know how much we paid them to clean up extra trash last year beyond their contract, and we know how many dumpsters got painted. So if you did it a bunch last year, and you're able to get numbers for those 3 sites, extrapolate them to 7 proportionally in some way, and come up with an offset number, did we lower a contractual line?
I want to say no, but I'm going to ask if I can explain that.
Sure.
You're asking about painting of dumpsters or number of junk vehicles towed. There's a savings there. Is it the big savings? No. We've mentioned that it's the contractor savings is the big savings, and a smaller portion of that is the City of Fairbanks resident users. That's where the big savings come from. That more than offsets the cost of the attendance. There was a question about why there was the higher number in there originally. If you go back to January when I'm preparing the budget, the best numbers I had was what we had paid last summer, which was around $78,000, $80,000 for, to have attendance at the transfer sites. The budget was put forth. Then the actual bids came in. They came in lower at $48,000. The Assembly was aware of that at the bid award time, and that was brought up in April, and the dollar amount was adjusted down. So as it sits right now, there's enough funding at the current rate, at the current actual prices of the contractors. So I want to clarify that. I didn't inflate it. I didn't mislead it. That's the numbers I had, okay? The other things that we're forgetting here is the comments regarding the safety and the comfort of the users that go to these sites. And that's a big factor as well, and the positive comments that I've been hearing and the others have been hearing.
Sure. So yeah, I'm going to address that.
When we stay with responding to what the Assembly is asking you.
I think I can address that then.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, so I want to bring up 2 points. One is if the big money that we're savings, the big savings we think we're getting is the non-quantifiable savings of stopping contractors and to a small amount city residents from coming. I think you could achieve the same purpose for those two things of having an itinerant, I'll call them that, attendant who drives around between sites and catches people unexpectedly. And so they're taking a risk, and businessmen don't necessarily like to take risks. And so they know there's going to be people going, and they could go to all the sites, but I'm not saying they need to. But the point is that's a method that costs a lot less money to achieve the same type of results if that's where our big money savings are. So from an enforcement perspective, I also wonder if we really have to paint the dumpsters that much. I mean, if it's offensive graffiti, yeah, we should paint the dumpsters. If it's just a big heart and a couple names, I don't know if it's that important. And maybe we ought to just think about not painting so many dumpsters. But as you said, that's a small amount of money. And then the last thing I want to point out is that I agree there are people on both sides. There are people who want to be able to go dump their trash at any time of day or night, and they don't want that hours, and that's the big argument against it. And people who don't like to necessarily see people standing around at the dumpster sites. And then there's people who really like the fact that it's nice and clean, and it's a nicer site. And I'll take Mr. Cooper's word for it. I didn't live in the city, so I only go there when I'm taking my parents' trash out there, so I don't get there all that often anymore. But I certainly in the past have used it a lot. But maybe what we ought to do, if we're not sure really of the overall population's attitude on what they really want, is maybe we ought to put it back to a vote at some point in time and say, how do you want your trash service? And get them to vote on it. And get them to come out and say, yes, we're okay with 5 days. Yes, we're okay with attendance, and put an actual dollar figure in that so they know what they're voting for. And maybe we ought to look at doing that if this is really such a good idea, and have the people approve that level of service. And then everyone will know that this is what they're going to get, and they'll know why it happened. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you. I have Mr. Lejewski and then Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, I've been thinking about those cars, and it'd be interesting if, and I forget, how many was it, like 100 a year? 150? 174. I'm just wondering if even one of those per year gets abandoned in the public right away, what that savings calculation is going to end up being. So anyway, I'm going to vote the same way I voted in the Finance Committee on this, and that's all.
Mr. Lawrence.
Just wanted to respond to Mr. Roberts' idea that we use a roaming attendant, and that would be as effective. I would remind the Assembly, I don't know how many transfer sites we have, what, 12 or 15?
14, 15.
14, spread over the size of the state of New Jersey. So I would submit that one roaming attendant isn't going to create any kind of concern to somebody who wants to illegally use, or dump at the transfer site when they're not allowed to. There's just, the chances of getting caught is minimal.
Mr. Tacky.
I just wanted to say, I do, like, as previously mentioned by Mr. Cooper, I do appreciate the signs that are there. They're very prevalent. That's a huge improvement. I think that also will deter some residents and some commercial users who just are under the impression already that they get that. And just to clarify, Mr. Jordan, I wasn't saying that you were intentionally inflating that number. I'm saying that you were just intentionally inflating the cost savings assumptions associated with the number that you had in the line because it made it wash perfectly is all. Thanks.
Mr. Roberts.
So, to Mr. Lawrence's point, that's valid, but I wasn't necessarily thinking we had to send the attendant to all, say, 14 sites. Right now, we're only having attendants at 7, so they can still go to those outlying sites if they really want to, if we're talking enforcement here. But having one just go to the 7 sites that are much closer to town probably wouldn't be as big a deal, and could probably keep them busy all day going between the sites and hitting them 2-3 times. They wouldn't do the same level of work, whatever that work is that they do out there. I don't know what extra work they're having them done, but they could at least, for what we consider the big savings, the enforcement part, that kind of surprise enforcement, if people know about it, a lot of people, they may not all follow the speed limit, but they keep it reasonable enough because they know there's some enforcement out there. It doesn't have to be on every corner.
Mr. Quist and then Mr. Lejewski.
Mr. Jordan, a minute ago, Mr. Tacky said that the projected cost savings from having attendant services was inflated, and I was wondering, could you speak to that? I mean, And I could
So-
expound on the question if you like, but you probably get it.
Okay, so the recommended budget had 312,000 or something in there for attendance services. And that's what I put in initially back in January, February-ish when the budget was prepared. Based a little bit upon what it would cost, based upon the cost that I knew about from last summer, okay? And then the actual bid went out. I got the actual numbers, and that ended up being lower. And that amendment, the $200,000 now ties exactly to the actual bid amount.
So if I may clarify here, so no, I think that we understand that, but Mr. Tackey will tell me if I'm mischaracterizing his remarks, but what I'm hearing is that he's suspicious of the projected cost savings, about how the projected cost savings quite neatly match up with the initial projected cost of attendance services. And the implication, or maybe it wasn't implication, maybe it was explicit, was that that projected cost savings figure, that it is inflated. Am I making sense? Or I could try a third way to ask it.
I'm not.
So, okay, we're initially in this proposed budget, it looked like there was about $300,000 of potential savings to the borough if we hired collection services. And that collection services was going to cost us about $300,000, and it was going to be a wash. And that savings end of it, that 300,000-ish figure, I'm hearing from Mr. Tackey, that number is inflated, and I'm curious from you, how did you come to that number? Do you feel that that's still an accurate approximation? And if I may, Mr. Tackey, am I expressing your view fairly?
Yeah, I might have accidentally explicitly characterized it as an inflated cost savings assumption. I just am questioning all the assumed savings that we would get. I don't know if it would necessarily be.
Seemed more like a constructed cost argument.
Yeah, thank you.
There's, I'm trying to think of how to say this, and there's a lot here. So there's estimates in line 39 and line 40, there's estimates, okay? Everything from what the tonnage is going to be for this year through the end of June. There's estimates for next year and what percentage increase it's going to be. It's the best estimate that I have, okay? Using often some historical increases from year to year. There's an estimate of where that tonnage is going to come from what site, from what area, because each area has a different price. That's why I use a weighted average. There's an estimate of what other costs they're going to have to pay. So you're hearing the word estimate quite a bit. In terms of the savings from the attendance, again, that's an estimate as well. I remember exactly how I came up with the 2,100 tons, and I'm sorry, I can't off the top of my head tell you that right now. But
Yeah. Clearly, you did your best to work through based on what assumptions that you had and numbers you had, and came up with the best figure you could based on that information.
On that, then,
Mr.
please.
Quist, yes, and then Mr. Roberts.
Thank you. So let's say, this is just, it's an estimate, but it's, a good faith, best attempt estimate. And let's say it's unintentionally inflated by twice. So let's say like it's not actually $300,000 savings. Let's say it's only $150,000 savings. Then these attendance services, if that were the case, and obviously this is just kind of a thought experiment here. If that were the case, then the attendance services would have a net cost of about $50,000. And so under such a situation, I would still say that's still a value, that we're increasing the quality of service significantly, and it costs $50,000. Now, I would say that's kind of a worst case scenario. I'm guessing Mr. Jordan, who's very diligent, isn't off by such a large margin. So I mean, based on that, I would speak against the amendment. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Roberts, I think I wasn't sure. I had you half written.
I was just going to say that all we're saying is that the estimates you used happen to exactly line up with the costs, and that's just strange. But we understand that it's because, as you've mentioned, we can't know how many people get stopped. There's no way to know that, so you have to just pick a number out of thin air. And the point we're making is that the number was out of thin air because there's no possible way of knowing how much you're stopping by having the attendance there. But I think we all agree you're probably stopping some, and that's why I gave what I thought was the solution. But so we're not saying anything about how you do the numbers, except that nobody could have done them any better, because that's just the way those kind of numbers work, because there's no big basis for it.
Thank you. Next, I have Mr. Merritt on this topic, or are you on the list?
All on this topic, so Mr. Jordan, you estimated reductions in tonnage and such on lines 39 and 40, and the cost of the attendance on line 41 is a separate calculation. So do you still stand by, if we had attendance, that we would have those savings? I mean, the cost of the attendance is irrelevant to what the savings would be, is my point here. So are you sticking by your tonnage reduction estimates on 39 and 40?
On the 2,100 tons?
Yes.
That was my estimate a few months ago. It would be still my estimate now.
Okay. And yes, I do take exception to the characterization that these numbers were pulled out of thin air. They are based on the best information that Mr. Jordan has available. And the expectation is we would still have these savings, and it would result then in a significant savings at the $200,000 rate to create over $300,000 in savings. So it's a net gain in the budget.
Thank you. Now I have Mr. Lejewski and then Mr. Cooper.
So I'm looking through the numbers here. I'm not seeing what I'm looking for, and I know you can help me. What's the savings as a result of reduction of commercial tonnage? Or the estimated savings? With the attendance. Yep.
The commercial tonnage is included in that 2,100 tons. So it's the diversion of the waste stream that shouldn't be going to the transfer site.
Okay, so the 2,100 tons is a little under 80,000 bucks, right? 79,485.
That's the hauling fee component. There's also a tipping fee component.
Okay, which is
in line 40, and it's 233,000.
Okay.
The simple way to think about it is, for every ton of debris that doesn't go to the transfer site that shouldn't be going there, saves the collection district approximately 38 bucks a ton, because they don't have to haul it. This means the taxpayers don't have to pay for that, as well as the collection district doesn't have to pay the tipping fee, whether it's 107 or 109 or 111, whatever number it ends up being. So it's approximately about $144, $145 per ton total.
okay, right, and you were saying the city estimated percentage of the current tonnage is 3%, the commercial is 10%.
That's
Which
the
means
number
that-
that I've used as a projection.
So the commercial is roughly 3 times the amount of the city, so that's, like 3/4, a little bit more than that, it sounds like, based off of your estimates of this problem. So what I'm getting at, I'm just trying to think creatively here, and I don't recall the specific privacy issues of installing cameras. And I know that there was a recording problem with public records, but I am wondering, what if we had live streaming cams with no record? They just streamed either to the internet, because public shaming is a way to deter bad behavior, or just to a private website for the one potential roaming attendant who can have real-time information, because it looks like the low-hanging fruit is this commercial tonnage. If you can deter that, you're going to get most of the savings here. It's not so much the city of Fairbanks tonnage and the abandoned cars and the repainting of the cans. It's
I don't think I'm going to tackle the live streaming question. I don't think that's mine. I don't know if anybody else
Okay.
does.
So we can,
I mean, from a legal perspective, we do have surveillance on some buildings for purposes of crime detection. It's typically recorded. We only go into those recordings if there's an incident. There, I believe, was discussions in the past about transfer sites and a general feeling that there could be vandalism and other things that wouldn't really make that investment worth it.
Mr. Cooper.
2 points. One, we talked a little bit about assumptions, which is something I wanted to hit on and note that, Mr. Jordan is the expert on this. He works in this field day in and day out, and so I don't think that my assumptions about usage and tonnage are any better grounded than Mr. Jordan's. I think that Mr. Jordan is making the best assumptions he can, and based on the data that he works with to know about the usage. So I don't think this debate is really about that. It's about the hours that whether or not we think it should be open 24 hours or not. And second, off of Mr. Quist's point, I think that even if the savings were a wash, it's still a good deal. I mean, that's, I guess, where we come out, right, is that it's a wash. Even if we're not saving $100,000, even if the savings amount to the cost of having attendance and it's a wash, that is still added value to the citizens of the borough. So just want to leave you with those 2 thoughts.
Okay, any last comments? Yes, Mr. Quist.
Thank you. So I just would like to note that this amendment is not dissimilar to one that we just discussed, in that it deals with an order of magnitude of money of some hundreds of thousands of dollars, and it affects the hours of service available to residents to use transfer sites. Yet, we seem to be pretty comfortable discussing it in this public meeting, whereas some members were uneasy discussing the last item in this setting. So, I mean, they seem very similar to me. I just wanted to make that sort of procedural note.
Mr. Tacky.
And I appreciate the clarification through Mr. Cooper. He actually pointed out that it's an effect on the hours, and I think that's a huge factor in this. And I think having more than just a 12-hour window is a huge thing in the middle of summer in Alaska. And having it be a reliable 12 hours also, too, just noted by Mr. Gray, is also another major factor. And so I think that is also one of the underlying reasons that I would be striking this line, unless we wanted to increase it and make it be from 6 a.m. till 10 o'clock at night. But then we'd have to go and rebid that contract, I would assume, and it would cost a lot more. So do we want to spend more money to actually have the service and the savings also to be able to have the deter? Or do we want to limit the hours for our residents?
Mr. Robertson, then Mr. Cooper.
I was just hoping that no one was thinking that I was uneasy about speaking of these things.
So noted. Mr. Cooper.
I guess this is, Mr. Tacky raises a point 7 to 7, right? I know one of the things we talked about with this experiment before is what hours are best, and I don't know, Mr. Jordan, where you're at with determining whether or not that can be shifted to different time frames during the day, so that a couple days of the week it's later, opens later and closes later, or if I know that these are things that we've talked about before, and I don't know that you necessarily have to give us an answer now, but for the benefit of Mr. Tacky's concern, I mean, these are all things that can be addressed with the funding that we have. What are ways that we can shift this to make it more convenient for folks at different times of the week?
And I'm just thinking that it seems like it might be a really good idea to have an advisory board for the solid waste disposal district. I hate to suggest that, but it seems like while we're working this kind of these really complicated, nuanced issues with our public, it might be good to have a board that you can work with and say, how does this work, and get some information. Mr. Tacky?
I was just going to say, rather than having an advisory board, I would agree with Mr. Roberts' comment earlier, put it to a vote of the citizens that are actually using these services. Every single resident uses it in some form or another. Let them decide, and then that's the will of the voters.
Okay. Any last, yes?
Mr. Gray?
Yeah, he would let me know. He hasn't said anything. Any last?
Yeah,
Oh, yes, Mr. Gray? Yes?
His name.
Oh, I said I was good.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okie dokie, are we ready to vote on the amendment which would zero out line 41, item P, attendance services at 5 main transfer sites, plus Esther and Fox, July 1 through October 31? Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes?
Mr. Cooper?
No.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Lojewski?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
3-6.
It fails 3-6. Okay. Yes, Mr. Cooper, are you going to move for a break?
I was going to move a very short budget motion. I hope it will be non-controversial, require little debate.
Right.
In the Department of Library Services, user fee schedule, ordinance attachment C, Romanet 2, Appendix E, page 756, line numbers, non-borough resident user fee. The dollar amount is 0. I move to amend the user fee schedule for library services as follows. Change, quote, non-borough resident user fee to, quote, non-FNSB resident library card, comma, non-ALC library member, paren must be Alaska resident. Close.
Is there a second?
I'll second,
Okay.
so I can find out what he's talking
It's
about.
in one of our sheets, yeah. So,
That wasn't cryptic enough for you?
Mr. Cooper has moved to make an amendment to change number of resident user fee to non-Fairbanks North Star Borough resident library card, comma, non-ALC library member, must be Alaska resident. Probably has to do with our new Alaska Library Catalog Consortium.
I'll read the reason stated on the budget motion. And then
Before you do that, I want to say thank you, Mr. Jordan, for coming up and helping us understand things. Thank you.
And I'm sure our library staff will tell us more, but the reason on the budget motion is the non-borough resident user fee needs to be clarified due to FNSB public libraries joining the Alaska Library Catalog Consortium. So maybe Ms. Harder can tell us more.
We hope.
Yeah, it's simply to clarify. We've had in the past this non-borough user fee for a card. If somebody's not living in the borough, obviously, and they want to use our library, and they can get a card if they pay a certain amount of money. We just wanted to make sure that that was clear with the ALC users, because it's going to get complicated.
Additional?
Yeah.
Well, as you know, the Alaska Library Consortium has several libraries, but there's also some libraries, such as Delta, that are not in that consortium. So occasionally we'll have somebody that travels up from Delta several times a year, and they want to have the borrowing privileges to borrow more than 3 items at a time or something. They can get a library card that says for $40, that's the fee, so that they can borrow just like any other user that has a library card within the borough, the Fairbanks North Star Borough. So what this is doing is just clarifying that if we left it non-borough resident user fee, it would make it sound like we would have to charge people around the state that are part of the consortium that fee. So we're just trying to clarify so that we can still allow people that aren't part of the consortium but outside of the borough, if they wanted that service, they could get a library card.
Okay. Any other questions or comments on the proposed amendment? Seeing none, clerk, looks like we're ready to vote.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Lojewski?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Gray? Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes, would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
9-0.
It's adopted 9-0.
Now I'd ask for a break. Yeah.
Okay. We'll take a, you guys want a 5-minute break? Or do you want to, okay. Okay, thank you, everybody. That was a fabulous 5-minute break. We stuck to it pretty closely. We are reconvened. And does anyone else have any amendments they wish to propose? I don't see any. I'm just going to check with my friend, Mr. Gray, and see if he's raised his hand.
No,
Nope.
I have no amendments.
No amendments? Okay, are we ready to vote? Mr. Roberts and then Mr. Quist.
Okay, so now I'll make an amendment. So the amendment is that any amount in the budget in the amended budget that we've arrived at this point, that's over the amount that would exceed last year's mill rate would be taken from general fund and brought in. So the result would be we would end up with a mill rate the same as last year.
Second for the sake of discussion.
Okay, so there's been a motion by Mr. Roberts, second by Mr. Tacky, that any amount of the budget over the amount expended last year, it looks like it says amount exceeded last year, the mill rate, last year's mill rate will be taken from general fund mill rate, so the mill rate will be flat.
Right, and
A
so...
little awkward writing, but yeah.
A little awkward speaking it. So I just want to
So on
ask
the motion,
Finance
on
to
the
give us a number.
Okay. Finance, do you have a number for that?
Have to get,
And that was moved by Mr. Roberts and seconded by Mr. Tacky, right? Was it? Thank you.
I need to wait for Peggy.
For the listening
She's got that
public,
worksheet
we're
open.
getting a figure at this time. Yes, Mr. Cooper?
And maybe I can ask Finance, well, Ms. Peggy already has the answer, so I'll.
Are we looking at a number?
Yes, please.
So Mr. Roberts wants to know the amount from fund balance if we keep the mill rate the same last year.
So the question is, how much would we be taking from general fund so that to maintain last year's mill rate?
And I'm speaking of the area-wide mill rate here.
Area-wide. And I would also ask for perhaps Ms. Dolan to let us know what that impact would be, or whomever would let us know what that impact would be on the tax cap next year. Does it lower it?
No, so the tax cap's based on the maximum allowable revenue. I think what Mr. Roberts is trying to do is basically say the mill rate is going to be apples to apples. And if there's amounts over, the tax cap will balance it for the general fund.
I don't believe that's what he's saying. Is that what you're saying?
No.
That's how I understood it. Okay,
What he's
so
saying,
then,
anything, we would only collect up to the mill rate.
The same mill rate as last year.
And
right, so if that,
And any money left over after we've collected enough on the area-wide mill rate, any money extra than that that's in the budget would be supplied from general fund.
We would draw
and
from
not be
general.
taxed this next year.
Right, so I
okay,
believe,
so we're assuming the mill rate then is going to bring us under the cap.
That was my assumption.
Okay, is
Yeah,
that
so what
right?
you want me to do is take from general fund balance, reduce the taxes to bring the tax mill rate down to what
it was last year.
it was currently.
Yes.
Yes.
And are you,
I'm only referring to the area-wide mill rate at this point.
Okay, so then, sorry, then I need to clarify, Ms. Dodge, the impact on the revenue cap will be for next year because
Yes,
you'll be
that is correct.
limited to the amount that you impose this year.
That's correct. Thank you. That was my understanding.
Yeah, yeah.
Ms. Brady.
Unless
Ms.
you
Brady, yes.
choose to designate that as a tax reduction, because there is a provision in the tax
Oh,
cap
that's true.
code that you can say that draw from fund balance does not affect the tax cap, but that has to be affirmative vote
Yeah,
on your
that's
part.
true.
That be
Good
your
point.
intention, Mr. Roberts?
Somebody else, we have that in front of us. They just passed that out, and somebody makes that motion every year.
I don't believe that's, okay. Is that, is, the- thank you.
I've got one.
Yeah, okay. So,
They handed it out.
thank you. I just wanted to make sure that,
Peggy? Yeah.
thank you. Okay, I'm sorry, so were we waiting for a figure? And okay. Mayor, you had your hand raised. Were you wanting to say something while we wait for a
I
figure?
wanted to clarify where Ms. Dolan went back and clarified, I was going to make the same comment. It does affect the tax cap, the way it currently is proposed.
Okay. Mr. Cooper, I had your name down. Do you want to wait until after we get the figure, or?
It was going to be an addition to Mr. Roberts' question to finance, which is how much with our current budget amendments we are over our 19% target reserve.
Ms. Dodge, I have a question on this.
Certain,
There's clarification on this exact point.
okay, the motion to be made of general fund point? Okay.
So as it's written here, it says it's being done in order to reduce the amount of property taxes levied on the taxpayer. The attorney said a minute ago that if it included I'm sorry, Ms. Brady said a minute ago, if the motion included the statement that the intent was to reduce the property taxes, then it would not have an effect on the tax cap. But then I just heard the mayor say that it would, and so I just want to, my question, I guess, is this statement here sufficient?
Yeah.
Is. Yeah, so it's in 804, 280 has some notwithstandings language for the tax cap, for the tax revenue cap, excuse me. One of which is if you designate those amounts as a tax reduction from the general fund. So I think the language that you've been handed out is sufficient to do that, so.
Yes, Mr. Roberts?
And it doesn't have to be simultaneous with this motion. Because there may be other motions where they were drawing from the general fund that could all be included with that one
Okay.
amendment.
Mr. Lejewski?
I just want to make sure I understand this correct. So the revenue tax cap can go up based off of a multiplier CPI based of the previous year's budget. Or, sorry, revenue tax cap basically. And so that's what this whole technicality is about, is whether the overall base before it's multiplied is going to be bigger or smaller by definition.
Correct. So it is not a limitation. After you do that calculation, amounts designated for purposes of taxpayer relief aren't counted for purposes of that cap.
Right, okay.
We're still waiting for a number, right? Okay. Okay, could you restate that, Jill? Your last statement?
So the limitation, so your tax revenue cap limitation excludes amounts designated by the Assembly to be used from fund balance in order to give taxpayer relief.
So that money is clearly still part of the calculation for the next year.
If you say this.
Just making sure I understand. That's what it seems, that's certainly the intent, it seems. Okay.
Depends on what you mean by calculation, but yeah, I think we're saying the same thing, yeah.
I'm going to clarify, these are estimates because we do not have certified assessed values yet, so things can go up and down and change. We would be taking $5,045,000 from fund balance to balance the budget and reducing the taxes by the like. To bring it to, right now I'm a little bit tiny over what the last year's, but I have to get down to playing with the numbers. Right now I've got it at 11.922, current year's 11.913, so it's tens of thousands of dollars I have to kind of play to
Right.
get it to the exact.
So it's a rough order.
And so where,
Rough estimate.
and so where would that leave the general fund?
20.
I don't know, we took,
So that would leave the general fund at about
18,
20
19.
million, so it would be under the target by about,
does that include the Mary Sy motion?
The Mary Sy portion, we were taking from fund balance to fund that. So that was
Okay.
not part of the designation. I'm just looking at, well, yeah.
So it kind of is involved? It's kind of included, roughly?
So it would be 5.4 million, 5,418,130 if we include Mary Sy with that.
Okay, thank you. Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
Well, you know, I know Mr. Roberts is a champion of keeping taxes as low as possible, but, I mean, that attitude is why we're in the fix we're in right now with deferred maintenance. And so, you know, I'm not going to support this amendment. And I realize I'm not running again, but I happen to think this community, you know, can afford to pay a little more in property taxes. You know, if we're going to save buildings like Mary Sy and, you know, it's just, you know, there's a real contradiction from Mr. Roberts tonight. He wants to maintain all services, but he doesn't want people to pay for it. And it gets a little frustrating.
See, I have Mr. Cooper and then Mr. Roberts.
All right, finance probably has better numbers than I do, but my rough calculation was that right now with the changes we made to the budget through tonight, including Mary Sy, and this is a little bit different way of looking at it, we're about 1.9, well, really close to $2 million over our reserve target amount. And so, just so folks have this in mind in terms of money to bring us to the target, if we use $1,989,478 is the number I came up with, you know, we could use that either for tax relief, as Mr. Roberts suggests, or perhaps more money into facilities maintenance. However, I don't support bringing it down the full $5 million, because I think that A, takes us below the target reserve that we ought to have in place, and B, I think we've got to find a balance there. I think Mr. Lawrence made a pretty good point on that.
Okay, I have Mr. Roberts next.
So, as I've stated before, my point of view is that we should look at those services, look at what the taxpayers originally voted for, where we've gone with them, how we've grown them, and moderate those services to fit within a sustainable budget, i.e. one that we can do the ongoing preventative maintenance within what this community can afford, which obviously isn't the level that's been needed. And so we've got to do something. Dang it, I had one more point. So I would say to Mr. Cooper that in the past, when I brought this motion up, which I do every year, that it's been modified by other members to amount that they felt more comfortable with. And so that's certainly open on the table to change the actual amount that we're taking out of general fund to cover the budget. And I would say what's important about taxpayer relief is that we still haven't come back up yet. Now, we expect to get there with the influx of military in a few years, but we're not there yet. And it would be great to provide a little tax relief to help the people who are having to pay one of the highest cost of livings in the country outside of rural Alaska. I can't remember the number, but I have those numbers, like utility bills 227% higher than the U.S. average, and all the other cost of living indexes all over 200-something%. So they pay a lot extra, and so there's a reason we need to leave those taxes down, because the cost of livings don't even usually include all the taxes. And so it's important for us. We can't compare ourselves to other countries, other people counties who have lower tax rates or higher tax rates and say, well, we're low compared to them because we've got those cost of livings that offset that. And so we've got to keep in mind our community and what they can afford overall, and taxes play a role in that. Thanks.
Okay, I have Ms. Cooper, Ms. Major, Mr. Cooper, and Mr. Lawrence.
So sorry, that was a good laugh.
We must need
so
it.
I just want to comment on Mr. Roberts' point, and I guess the one challenge that I have with that, I mean, yes, we have a very high cost of living. However, we also do enjoy not having to pay a state income tax. And granted, there are some other states out there that have a lower cost of living than we do, and they don't have a state income tax. But I think trying to just compare us on the cost of living or an income tax is really probably not the right comparison to make. And we have heard from a lot of people who want to see services increased, but yet nobody wants to pay more for it or have those services reduced. And so there is certainly that challenge. Thank you.
I see Debbie has her hand up.
I was just going to note that the draw from fund balance for Mary Sy plus Mr. Roberts' motion would put you at 14.6% of your, to compare it to where your target is.
Thank you, of 19%, right?
17%.
17.
17.
Thank you. I have Mr. Cooper next.
All right, one point and then one question. And the point is not that anybody probably has this with them, but if you go back to the original budget presentation from the administration, page 36 has a historical list of mill rates and where we're at historically. And we're doing a lot better in 2018 than we were in 1999, and we're still below the historical area-wide mill rate average overall. So our mill rate is actually doing pretty good when you look at it as a trend. And the question I have for the administration is, every year we talk about FMR and money in facilities maintenance. Do you see a need for more money in facilities maintenance right now? And if so, how much money would you like to see in facilities maintenance?
And where are we?
50 million.
My checkbook is only so big, though.
That's the problem. Your checkbook is only so big, and realistically, we need more money than you could possibly put in because of the hole we've been digging. And I've been explaining that. So, whatever you think we can afford, we can use on maintenance. Our backlog is hundreds of millions of dollars, and there's no way we're going to take care of that in 1 year or 2 years. It's a long-range plan to dig out of there. And so we need to change our business model and do things differently than the way we have been, and just quit trying to put Band-Aids on things and hope that something's going to change in the future, that we'll get money from somewhere. And we need to be more realistic. We need to be real Alaskans and stand on our own 2 feet. The state's not going to turn around in a hurry. They've been, I think, worse than us as far as deferring maintenance. They have over $1 billion problem on deferred maintenance. So when they get more revenue there, it's going to go into their problem, not ours. And so what could we use? We could use $5 million. We could use $10 million on it. Right now, we don't even have the staff, though, that could spend that much. We'd have to add some staff in Public Works to be able to manage that much money. So without adding to their staff, we could certainly use a couple $1 million more right now and manage that than what we put in the account. In theory, we really could use $50 million a year. And we've got 5.5. So how much do you want to add? There you go. Get your checkbook out.
And I guess that goes to the point that my preference would be to spend this money that I see over our target reserve on facilities maintenance. And I don't know if I can move to amend Mr. Roberts' motion the way it's currently structured. or if we just make it a separate motion. But I guess I would speak in this year against using extra fund balance to buy down essentially the mill rate, and instead put that money where I think we have a greater need right now, which is in facilities maintenance reserve. And I would look to put about $1.9 million from fund balance into FMR.
Okay, well, so,
I'm not
yeah,
making an
I understand.
amendment, no.
I'm just going to read the amendment back because the clerks needed it, and it sounds like if they don't have it, there are others that are probably unclear about what it says. So it says, any amount in budget over the amount exceeded last year's mill rate will be taken from general fund to keep the mill rate flat, essentially. Is that close enough, Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Okay. So that's the amendment in front of us. Did you have your hand up, Mr. Mayor, or you? Okay. Mr. Roberts.
So, in support of this, and to speak somewhat against what was just mentioned as an alternative, I would like to point out that at the moment, we still need to come up with some amount of money, of which I'm not sure what that amount is, that we are over budget on currently after getting through this process. So we can't just take the money and put it all in FMR. We still have this chunk of money that has to be taken care of, which usually comes out of general fund if we're going to do that. So I just want to make sure everyone remembers that.
So I have a lot of hands. We'll go with
So
Peggy.
before this motion and in your substitute, we are balanced, and we do have, and after the motion for community planning, we have, let me just get down to where, we're putting a little bit of money to fund balance based on, we're putting 210, 100 to fund balance.
So we actually had more cost decreases during the Finance Committee than increases?
We had decreases, plus we had additional revenue that came in for community assistance.
Okay,
So-
well, I wasn't here for the last Finance
So
Committee
we
meeting,
did
so.
put, in your
Great.
substitute, you'll see that we are putting 225, 100 to fund balance. With the community planning amendment, I just reduced that by that $15,000.
Thanks.
I was going to say, that's what I did in my calculations too, so that's,
Okay.
we're on the same page.
Anything more? You're next up.
That was it.
No, Mr. Lawrence is next up.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Mr. Roberts' statistics regarding the cost of living in this community. He's right. The utilities were the highest, some of the highest utility rates in the country. I think twice as high as Anchorage is, which puts us at a huge disadvantage. Medical care in Alaska is absurdly high. Housing, you compare us with San Francisco, we've got low cost of housing. Food, back when I first got up here, late 70s, early 80s, food was incredibly expensive, much more expensive than outside. That's not the case anymore. Food is only slightly higher here than in the lower 48, by and large. So the point I want to make, and I used to work for the Consumer Price Index, for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, collecting data on the Consumer Price Index here in Fairbanks. And I can assure you that our cost of living does not exceed the rest of the country anywhere near as much as it did 20 years ago, 10 years ago.
Okay. Mr. Lajewski, you're next.
Is there anybody after me? If not, I'm
Well,
going to make a
not at
motion.
this time, but
Okay.
You've got me on the main motion, I hope?
Or,
it's on the,
We have no amendment.
If
on
there's
the
no one after
amendment.
me, I'm going to make an amendment to the amendment.
okay.
So the amendment to the amendment, I don't have the exact language, but the concept's quite clear. The money that's left in excess of the recommended, 17% in the general fund, I want 50% to go to facility maintenance reserve and 50% to go to buying down the tax cap.
Second.
Okay, let me see what I can do to restate that.
Buying down the mill rate.
Mill rate.
Or, yes, that's what I meant.
Yeah.
I second your second.
So the original amendment was any amount in the budget over the amount exceeded last year's mill rate taken from general fund mill rate to keep it flat. I'm not sure how we would amend that. It may be back to, we may need to vote on it and then come back to your amendment.
Okay, well, I
don't
think
see a,
if I can withdraw that, then I think I can just amend the current one to say 50% of the excess of the target reserve going to buying down the mill rate,
budget over
rather than
exceeded last year.
to the point of last year's mill rate.
So any amount in budget over amount exceeded last year's mill rate taken from general fund. And you want to say 50% taken from,
We're going to use up basically 50% of our surplus to buy down the mill rate.
I think we'd be better served as this is written to vote
Okay,
on.
I will withdraw
this.
my, if I may withdraw my,
Someone can see.
Want to make, once it's on the floor and been seconded, then you're going to have to either vote on it in order to withdraw it. There can't be no objection to withdraw it, but we have Mr. Gray online, so you're going to have to vote whether to withdraw it.
Unless someone can see a way to do it.
So we can vote to withdraw the amendment as long as everybody
Yeah,
agrees.
I move to withdraw the amendment.
Okay.
Is there a second?
We've already got it here. If you just want to withdraw it, we can.
Just vote on withdrawing
Okay.
it.
Yeah, let's do that.
Withdrawing Wojciechowski's?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it was seconded. So please call the roll.
Okay,
I'm withdrawing the amendment to the amendment.
Thank you. Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Lojewski?
yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Anyone want to change their vote? Seeing none, that amendment is withdrawn, and we're back to the original amendment. Are we ready to, Mr. Quist, were you on that, or you were on the main
No, on the
budget?
main motion,
Okay.
please. Thank you.
So we're ready to vote on the proposed amendment, and do you want me to read it again, or are you fairly clear what it says? Okay, clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Gray?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
No.
Ms. Major?
No.
Mr. Quist?
No.
Mr. Lojewski?
No.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
No.
Mr. Lawrence?
No.
And Ms. Dodge?
No. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
1-8.
it fails 1-8. Mr. Lojewski,
Yeah, I've got a motion.
can you write it down?
It's not, is this the one we want?
Right there. Yep.
Maybe while Mr. Lojewski's writing his motion, I could,
Make a comment?
I just have a comment, not a motion.
I'm
I
good
just,
with-
thank you. I'd just like to comment that after, like, I don't think drama, all the drama is, I don't think that's too strong of a word, of the meeting that we had the other week where we're discussing the resolution about the minimum funding for the school district. After all of that, and all of that, in my opinion, unwarranted concern, we find ourselves probably just minutes away from voting on a budget where we're going to be giving to the school district their full amount that they requested, $50,045,400. So I just, and I mean, I think that that's the right thing to do. I mean, I'm going to be voting for that. But I just think it's interesting that this is actually not really as controversial as it appeared to be a couple weeks ago. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Lojewski is just about done, I think. For those of you on the radio, we're just taking a brief at ease while we craft an amendment so that we all are clear what it is that we're considering. I'm not trying to read my scribbles. We managed. Anybody else have any comments on the budget overall, Mr. Lawrence?
Well, no, I thought Mr. Cooper would have an amendment, but maybe he wants to wait to see what happens on this thing.
Yeah, I was going to wait and make any comments on the rest of the budget until we're done with this particular issue.
Well, yeah, I'll make a comment.
Okay, Mr. Lawrence, go for
Say
it.
it again. Any motion, any amendment that is designed to decrease the mill rate I will vote against simply because I think this community, is willing to support the government services. They certainly have been here asking for them. And so, I'm just giving a heads up to Mr. Lejeski. I don't mind appropriating some of the fund balance to the facility maintenance fund at all, but as far as the reducing the mill rate, I will oppose that.
Okay, Mr. Lejeski. Want to read it to me, and I'll make the change.
Yep. Let's either, there may be a typo in here, so
Yeah.
correct the grammar.
I will.
I'm going to read it as it's supposed to be.
Okay.
Move 50% of the general fund balance that is in excess of the 17% reserve to the facilities maintenance reserve account, and the other 50% to be used to buy down the mill rate.
Okay, so Mr. Lejeski has moved 50% of the general fund balance that is in excess of the 17% reserve to the facilities maintenance reserve account, and the other 50% to be used to buy down the mill rate. Is there a second?
Second.
So it's been seconded by Mr. Tackey. Mr. Cooper, Mr. Lejeski, you want to speak to it?
Well, I agree very much with Mr. Roberts with the idea of buying down the mill rate. I think we should have it as low as possible, but I also am acutely aware of our capital budget issues, basically, and putting money to the facility maintenance reserve is a way of dealing with our, basically, building problems in the borough. So it'd just be a 50-50 split between the two that I think are both very important.
Does the second wish to speak to it?
That is actually my same thought process. I mean, a little bit rather than being right at the tax cap, not hindering ourselves by actually giving it as a taxpayer relief in the future, and also exactly applying some to our facilities maintenance reserve fund, which is necessary to help keep us afloat, but at the same time, not giving them too much money that they need to hire somebody else to actually do the work. Thanks.
Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. I still think that we'd be better served by putting the full amount towards facilities maintenance in this budget year, so that will remain my position. I guess I have a question for Ms. Dolan with the amendment as worded. Is it assumed to mean that it's the amount in excess of the 17% target reserve after all budget adjustments have been made, or do we need to add anything to the motion to clarify that?
That's the intent.
That should probably be stated if that's the intent, because normally at the end of the budget, you actually make a specific motion on that.
Right. So I guess I'd move to amend the amendment to add language indicating that it's 50% above the 17% target reserve after all budget adjustments have been made.
Second.
Okay, so let me. So we have had Mr. Cooper has moved and Mr. Lejeski has seconded an amendment to the amendment. So it would now read, move 50% of the general fund balance that is in excess of the 17% reserve after all budget adjustments have been made to the facilities maintenance reserve account, and the other 50% to be used to buy down the mill rate. Is there any, I can't do any objection, can I? Okay. Are we, yes, Mr. Roberts, on the amendment to the amendment?
Oh, it's just the amendment to the amendment.
Oh, yes.
No comment.
Okay. Are we ready to vote on the amendment to the amendment? It will not carry the amendment. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Lejeski?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
No?
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
8-1?
And who, Mr. Lejeski, you were the second one on that, right?
I wrote down.
Okay. So we're back to the amendment as amended. Mr. Roberts, you were up next, I think.
Oh, I was going to say that even though I wish that amendment hadn't been put on at this point, I certainly support the concept of trying to help the community by lowering that mill rate. And while there may be a lot of people who are willing to pay more to try and get a higher level of service, there's certainly plenty of people struggling with their utility bills, and the expenses we do have that are still high. Though I agree with Mr. Lawrence, they're not as bad as they used to be. But there's still people who need that financial relief, and I'm going to look out for them, and I'm going to vote for this amendment.
Okay. Anybody else on the amendment as amended? Mr. Lawrence?
Well, I don't think it's in the best interest, frankly, of this community to reduce the fund balance for the purpose of reducing the mill rate. This fund balance is going to be utilized, for a lot of things coming up. It's not like we've got money to burn just because we're over 17% right now. I suspect that won't be the case in the course of this next fiscal year, that it's going to be reduced. And therefore, I'd urge this assembly to look at the big picture, look at what financial straits this borough is in, and frankly, try to, the tax cap is restricting our revenue more than we can afford, frankly. So let's not make it worse by reducing the mill rate below what we can collect under the tax cap.
Mr. Cooper?
Thanks. So I was thinking about how to, raise my point most efficiently procedurally, and I think this will be the best way to do it. So I'm going to move to amend the amendment to, rather than do a 50-50 split, that 100% in excess of the 17% reserve after the budget adjustments have been made goes into facilities maintenance reserve.
Is there a second?
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Lawrence that the amendment be amended to read, move 100% of the general fund balance that is in excess of the 17% reserve after all budget adjustments have been made to the facilities maintenance reserve and account, and delete and the other 50% to be used to buy down the mill rate. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. On the amendment, yes, would you like to speak to the second like to speak to that?
Well, just brief. I've got a question. From finance, how much money are we talking about again, as far as approximately how much money are we talking about as far as how much the general fund exceeds 17%?
If you take into account what you did in Finance Committee and the Mary Sy, we're looking at an excess of just over $2 million.
All right, thanks.
Mr. Cooper?
And I'll note there may be some changes to that with IGCP and other things still
Yes.
too, so it could get smaller in any other appropriations, if any, that we make here tonight. But I don't want to belabor the point. I think I've made my point about facilities maintenance. So.
Anybody else on the amendment to the amendment? Yes, Mr. Lawrence.
We have a finite amount of money. I think it's more appropriately applied to facilities maintenance than it is to tax relief.
Okay. We appear to be ready to vote on the amendment to the amendment. And I won't rule that it's going to carry the main amendment. Clerk, please call the roll.
Mr. Tacky?
Do you want me to read it again, or are everybody clear what we're doing?
I just
Okay.
didn't want to do the first one.
Okay.
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
No?
Mr. Lajewski?
No.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
7-2.
The amendment is amended, and we're back to the amendment. And I don't have anybody written down on the amendment as amended. See any remote hands being raised? Yep, Mr. Lajewski.
I think it's a shame we're leaving out the taxpayer here, but since we are leaving them out, this is the next best thing. So I'll support this as a purpose for what to do with above the 17%.
Ms. Major.
So I'll agree. I mean, I think, it is unfortunate that that the taxpayers may not benefit from this. It's, but when I look at the use of that $2 million, I do think the use of that $2 million serves, has a much greater value applied to the deferred maintenance than what it would potentially give an individual taxpayer back, which probably would not be very, very much money for any individual, but I do think it could make a small, very small dent in, very small dent in some of our deferred maintenance, and perhaps can defer some, or I'm trying to find the right word, but could. I think that the dollar value today is much greater than a benefit that any benefit to the taxpayer that it would have later. Maybe I said that wrong, but.
Thank you. Any other comments on the amendment as amended? Mr. Mayor?
Well, I would support it, particularly, I've been concerned with exactly what was going to transpire with the changes with Mary Sy. And I think that was very likely to end up forcing us to close something else because of not having enough money. And so this will hopefully preclude us from getting into that situation at this point in time anyway, in the near future. So I appreciate that and would support this.
Okay. Anything else on the amendment? Seeing none, clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Wojcicki?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
8-1.
it is adopted 8-1. We're back to the main motion. Mr. Cooper, do you have any motions you'd like to make?
I'll make the IGCP motion.
Okie dokie.
I move to allow financial services to make any necessary budget adjustments to IGCP to reflect or incorporate assembly changes.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Tacky to allow financial services to make any necessary budget adjustments to IGCP to reflect/incorporate the assembly changes. Discussion, debate? Seeing none, clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Wojcicki?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes, would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none,
9-0.
it's unanimously adopted. Yes, Mr. Cooper?
I guess a question for the administration. The motion for fund balance to balance the budget, that does not need to be made, correct?
No, it does. It does not. We just need to make the final budget motion now.
Right. Thank you. Just wanted to double check. My memory was right.
Okay. Does that mean you have another motion, Mr. Cooper?
Not in front of me.
Okay, there it is. Ask
I
and
do
ye
now.
shall receive.
I move to allow financial services to make the necessary budget adjustments to balance the approved budget and finalize the approved budget ordinance.
Second.
So it's been moved by Mr. Cooper and seconded by Mr. Tacky to allow financial services to make the necessary budget adjustments to balance the approved budget and finalize the approved budget ordinance. Discussion, debate.
So
Yes, Mr. Roberts.
was this the IGCP one?
No, we just did
voted
that
on
one,
This
yeah.
is the budget.
This is the budget. This is necessary budget adjustments.
This is just adjustments. This
Just
is the
This
final
is the
one.
pro forma one.
Okay, no comments.
Okay. For the listening public, these are all kind of pro formas that help give financial services the tools they need to mop up little pieces, parts, as they need to. Discussion, debate, I see none. Clerk, I think we're ready to roll. Vote, that is.
Okay. Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Wojcicki?
Yes.
Mr. Tacky?
Yes.
Mr. Roberts?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote?
9-0.
Seeing none, it's adopted, or that is adopted 9-0. That takes us back to the main budget as amended broadly. The substitute, thank you, as amended. Any discussion, Mr. Roberts?
So we ended up over last year's approved budget about approximately $4.5 million more, and of course, a higher mill rate. So I don't think we succeeded. We increased government, increased the size, increased the scope, and spent more dollars. And as pretty much everyone admits in the whole conversation we've been having about this, we're still on an unsustainable trajectory. We didn't put 50 million into the maintenance reserve, and what we did isn't going to be enough to catch us up. So if we're not cutting services to meet that at some point, we're going to have the same problem next year. And so I'll be voting no on the budget. Thank you.
Mr. Cooper.
Thanks. I guess I wanted to make 2 points. One, yes, I think as Mr. Roberts noted, we've exceeded last year's budget by, I can't remember the exact number, but we've also made a substantial contribution to facilities maintenance this year, not only in our initial contribution to FMR, but in what we just did with excess funds in our fund balance. We also, I think, for the first time this assembly, when considering the Department of Public Works, really, and I thank the mayor for making this emphasis in his proposed budget, we have a Department of Public Works structure that's a little bit different than before, that is really going to be focusing on these things. And I think it is going to make a dent, and it's the direction that we have to go. So I think that where we're at right now, this money, and to summarize, I think Ms. Major's point, is better spent on this facilities maintenance than it is buying down the mill rate. And, you know, in prior years, I've voted to support using general fund to buy down the mill rate, and that's just, I don't think that's the right thing to do this year. The other important thing, and Mr. Quist kind of beat me to it, but, you know, it goes to the point that I was making when we were talking about the minimum funding resolution for the school district. We had a lot of debate and gnashing of teeth about 48 million or not, but at the same time, we all said that we were going to fund the district at the amount it requested, which is exactly what we did with nary a peep about it here tonight. So perhaps we all got it out of our system over the last few weeks talking about it. But that, I think, is the problem that I saw with how we were handling the minimum funding resolution. So I am happy that we have decided to do what we said we were going to do all along and fund the district at its requested amount. Also, I know that the school board has a special meeting on Monday to consider spending some of its fund balance to bring back teachers and other services that have been cut. So I appreciate that the school board, as part of this conversation, is you have yet to act, but at least you're taking some of this conversation back and acting on it. So thank you for doing that. And in the end, I think that this budget had a lot of tough choices. I know we all sat here for long amounts of time listening to the wish list because there were so many things that people wanted to do that just couldn't be accommodated within the budget that we had. You know, so I, in the end, it's still not a sustainable budget. I think that it accomplishes many of the things that we need to accomplish to move the borough forward. Really appreciate administration, finances, and all departments' support in putting it together and getting it to where it is. So I support it in the end.
Okay. Mr. Lawrence.
Yeah, a couple of matters. As Mr. Quist and Mr. Cooper stated, and Mr. Doran, I hope there was a lot of drama on what I consider to be a fairly meaningless resolution, a lot of drama that was generated by the school administration. I hope you will let the school administration know that other than us commenting on the lack of any discussion, there was never any question, and not one person voted to not award or not appropriate to the school district the exact amount of money that they asked for. And that's the way it was going to be from the beginning. So when I think about all the emails, all the testimony, you know, I find it pretty frustrating that many people were misled. I concur with Mr. Roberts. He says, basically, this budget is not sustainable. We must reduce services. I'm going to point out that we've got to come up with a consensus of what services to reduce. The administration proposed reducing the solid waste budget by $500,000 by reducing transfer site availability by a day and a half per week. That was rejected. You know, Mary Sy, shutting down Mary Sy. I realize there's a lot of good arguments to keep it open, but, you know, again, You know, we've got people on this assembly who you know, promote themselves as being conservative, being libertarian, trying to be as small government as possible, and yet, you know, on those two proposals from the administration, they rejected it. So, you know, I concur. We're going to have to reduce services to this borough. There's no question about it. And we better start figuring out what to reduce, because, you know, we sure as heck rejected a couple of good suggestions this time around.
Ms. Major.
So first, I want to start by thanking Mr. Cooper for clarifying my earlier point far more eloquently than my tired brain could this evening. So this was my first, sort of, I guess, budget season as a new assembly member, and it was definitely quite the learning process. What I was a little concerned about as we, spent our Saturdays here was the fact that it seemed like there were some really big decisions. And I know we alluded to this earlier, but some really big decisions being brought forward to the assembly that really sort of was outside the public process, right? Where we were able, outside of the opportunity to have some really good debate. And so it's my hope that we can kind of take the momentum that we've gained from this process as we go from formulation to execution, and not just go, okay, well, you know what, we'll think about that next January, but actually take this momentum, and especially for the administration, to drive real change next year. So to start early, so when we're getting ready for the budget season next year, we've had that public debate, we've gone through that process, and we're ready to come to the table with some real efficiencies that I think the folks can stand by, because I too agree with everyone that our current budget is unsustainable, and it's that unsustainable at the local level, the state level, the national level, and I look forward to having more in-depth discussions on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cooper.
I just wanted to, in response to Mr. Lawrence's comment, I want to clarify my point, which, with regard to the minimum funding resolution, which is certainly the district helped create some drama, but I think that this assembly helped create a fair amount of drama around it too for little reasons. So I think we both ought to take that into consideration next year.
Mr. Tackey, and then Ms. Dominique.
I would like to point out as well that this is an unsustainable budget in the long run, and we are going to have to cut services, which is unfortunate, but us as a community need to look at that. But the characterization of saving $500,000 in our solid waste disposal fund, which actually isn't up against the tax cap, that's a separate fund. It's different monies, as we had pointed out earlier. It's not affected by the tax cap because it actually generates its own revenue to balance itself, if I'm not mistaken. So that characterization is a little off, but yes, same deal. Also harp on the minimum funding resolution situation. That was a little unfortunate, but same time, every voice in the community needs to be heard. So glad that we got the opportunity to hear from everyone.
Speaking of which, Ms. Dominique.
Well, I guess I'll start out with, what would the world be without drama? I just feel that those conversations were needed early on. They didn't happen. And I look forward to having those conversations early on for the next year. And I would really appreciate if you all would pass the 50 million, 45, 400,000. It would really help our school district and to continue educating our students. Thank you.
Good. Mr. Lajewski.
So with respect to the school district funding, I'm going to repeat the comment I've made a few times already. When there's a substantial balance of money, it's very easy if we pass let's just use, for example, let's say we guarantee $48 million minimum funding and you want 50, to designate $2 million as a contingency fund so that you can have your whole budget guaranteed and not send out what I'm going to call erroneous pink slips, right, to somebody who's not actually going to get laid off, fake ones. And I think that's correct management of the school district. I think we've got some very smart people at the school district, on the board, and in the management. And it makes me wonder why that's not being done. Okay? to me, it's a no-brainer if I was on the school board. That's the way things would be done, given that there's enough funds to do it. I could understand in some years it might not be practical. But at any rate, that's all I'll say about that. So with the facilities maintenance reserve going up, again, I am disappointed it's not going to tax relief, but I'm going to try to look at that optimistically. I think there's a good chance that that's going to reduce the mill rate in the future. The mechanism for that is I think that makes it less likely that we'll need bonds for our buildings, and bonding is just a way of backdooring the tax cap. So if we don't bond, we have a lower tax cap in the future. Sorry, I'm misusing tax cap and mill rate again. We have a lower mill rate in the future if we don't bond, or if we bond less. I am in agreement that this budget is unsustainable. Reductions, the only way to really fix that I see, I mean, you could bond a whole lot. I think anyone who knows me knows that I'm not going to be a proponent of that, because that's just increasing the mill rate again. But aside from that, the only way to fix it is to reduce services. And I will acknowledge, and I know that there has been potentially hypocrisy seen, and I'll explain why it's not, but that, you know, I was one who voted to keep Mary Saya open. It's because, to me, when we reduce services, if we're going to go down that road, we need to give those user groups sufficient time. There's an ethical way to do it and an unethical way, and I think we were pulling the plug too quickly, not enough notice, and so we should be giving at least, I'd say, 12 months notice if we're going to just cut off a service from somebody, so that that user group has time to prepare. I think that's the right way to do it, if and when we're going to do that in the future, which means if we're thinking about that for next year, we got to be getting on it now in the next few months, targeting which services we want to get rid of and start taking the heat now. I'll also note that I was in support of making the dump more efficient and having those savings via lower tipping fees go into the community. So I feel like I've been more or less ideologically consistent, but at any rate, when it comes to this budget, this is my first time, you know, this is my first year on the Assembly. I think my grievances have all been heard with it. I'm going to measure next year's budget against this one. If it's less unsustainable or is in fact sustainable, I doubt it will be, but if it's less unsustainable, I'll vote for it. For now, I'll hold my nose and I'll vote for this one for this year.
Mr. Gray.
Sure. First, I think I brought this up last week, but I was really surprised that nobody really came and testified about education last week. I mean, kudos to the Mary Saya group for coming and actively participating in government. I just want to say that I think that's how the process should work. They came and voiced their concerns. I think that I agree with those that said we are kind of on an unsustainable path or trajectory. And I think we're going to have to look obviously much harder next year, but I think we're doing the best we can based on what we have, trying to balance providing the right amount of services to people. Yes, obviously, Mary Saya was the most outspoken group, and we heard their concerns, and I think that we reinforced that we did hear them and we listened. So I know it's a lot of hard work for everybody, but I think that I'm okay with where we are for now.
Okay, any last comments, discussion, debate on the budget? Seeing none, Clerk, I think we're ready to vote.
We're on the substitute as amended. Are we going to carry the main?
Thank you. Pardon me? It will carry the main, yes, thank you.
Mr. Roberts?
No.
Mr. Tackey?
Yes.
Mr. Gray?
Yes.
Ms. Major?
Yes.
Mr. Quist?
Yes.
Mr. Lojeski?
Yes.
Mr. Cooper?
Yes.
Mr. Lawrence?
Yes.
Ms. Dodge?
Yes. Would anyone like to change their vote? Seeing none?
8-0?
It is
8-1, excuse me.
8-1. It is adopted 8-1. With that, let me find my agenda. I believe that we're probably to, thank you. Everybody's got one but me. That's because they're ready. Well, we're on citizens' comments. So this is citizens' comments. It'll be B. Each permit, it's items other than those appearing on the agenda. So we, at this time, if someone wants to come and speak for 3 minutes on an item other than that appearing on the agenda, and what was on the agenda tonight really was the budget. So, Mr. Dowdy, come on. Please give us your name and spell your last name. And tell us your neighborhood. You'll have 3
Asa
minutes.
Dowdy, D-O-W-D-Y, live on Steel Creek Road. I would like to speak on conduct of the citizens speaking myself last week. Somebody was a little bit upset maybe what I said about mismanagement. But this borough goes a lot of money into tourism. These buildings that are being nominated for destruction is a big part of tourism. And they have been neglected. Not just by this administration, but others. So I didn't think I was wrong there. And you're all going on, we need more assets for this community. In my opinion, you have the people in this community. There is many people that will work on these buildings, Sternwheeler, whatever. They have got to be given a chance. They will come up with ideas that the administration will never think of, the individuals. So please, give the citizens a chance. If you don't get any criticism, you're not doing your job. Because I'm not going to agree with any and every one of you. And you're not going to agree with me. But if we bring it out in the open, we can deal with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dowdy. Let's see, Mr. Roberts has a question for you.
Yeah, we just got a letter today from a constituent who was a contractor talking about coming in and doing work at Mary's side. Do you believe that we should allow volunteers to come in and work on some of these facilities for us?
Yes, I don't think we have any choice if we're going to save them.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Dowdy? Seeing none, thank you. Thank you for staying with us for this evening and listening attentively and participating. Anybody else wish to come down and speak on citizens' comments, items not on the agenda? I'm seeing no one coming forward, so we're going to close those citizens' comments. And that will take us to assembly member comments. We'll start, Mr. Gray, we'll give you the first bite of the apple. Do you have any comments you wish to make?
No, I have no further comment than that. I've said. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms.
It's
Major?
late for me.
Yes, it's really late for you. Thank you for staying with us. Ms. Major?
Just a comment that I won't be here again next week. I'll be traveling for work, leaving this weekend. So, but I'll be thinking of all of you.
Mr. Roberts?
Yeah, I guess I wasn't going to be here next week either, but is that meeting actually happening? We put one in the calendar. I thought maybe it was a placeholder.
At this time, we don't have a meeting next week. We do, oops. At this time, we have a special meeting. I believe it should be, well, I won't curse it by saying it'll be short.
Okay, thanks.
Mr. Quist?
I have no comment, thank you.
Mr. Cooper?
I guess a quick comment since Mr. Dowdy is still here. I will comment that I don't find Mr. Dowdy's comments problematic. I think you're right. We probably don't always agree on everything, but I appreciate the input that Mr. Dowdy provides. I think some of the comments that were referred to in the editorial paper are some of the more vitriolic and ad hominem comments that we're, at least from my perspective, hearing more of, where people are being called names or liars or untruthful and things like that. And I'll speak for myself in saying that I think that we can disagree about ideas and policy, but when people start, name calling, that's, I think, the emphasis of that editorial, with which I agree.
Thank you. Mr. Tackey?
Oh, I have no comment, thanks.
Mr. Lajewski?
Yeah, we made it, that's all.
Thank you. Mr. Lawrence?
Yeah, I think Mr. Dowdy has one pretty good point about maybe getting citizens to work on some of these facilities. I don't see that working when we're talking, even a contractor, getting involved, let's say with Mary Sy, but what occurs to me is the riverboat Nanana. I know I paint, the Kiwanis Club that I'm in, helped paint that boat back in the 80s, and I think that that sternwheeler is one asset in this community that untrained hands can do a decent amount of work on. So, I'd like to see that happen. This is my sixth budget. It's been one of the hardest budgets, actually, that I've had to deal with. And I'm glad it's over.
Mr. Mayor, do you want a second bite at the apple? You have any comments you want to make?
Well, this is my first chance to make comments, so I can not necessarily second. I absolutely agree. It's nice to use volunteers. I expanded the volunteer program working on our facilities when I was at Parks and Rec. I absolutely believe in it. There are some things they can't do, however, where certified people are required for a number of different tasks. So we'll use them where we can, and it's an excellent resource in our community. I completely agree. We're the proud recipients of a statewide award for having the Outstanding Recycling Community of 2017 that was presented to us down in Anchorage a week ago, and a cute little recycled award that I really enjoyed. Anyway, I might just pass that along. You can take a look at the melted drinking cups that were recycled to make the award. Today is Senior Recognition Day. We had a great lunch over at the Carlson Center with, I think, 6 centurions over 100 years old. Yeah, pretty awesome. Some real spry 100-year-old folks, too. I was quite impressed. So kudos to all our seniors in our community and what they do for us. And hopefully we all get to live that long, too, and enjoy our community. Lots going on right now. This weekend, there's 3 different walks. There's the Walk for Charity Friday night, sponsored by Alaska Travel Industry and Explore Fairbanks, starting at 6 o'clock. And then Saturday, there's 2 separate walks. The Heart Walk starts downtown at Veterans Memorial Park, 9 o'clock check-in, 10 o'clock start for the walk. And then in the afternoon, there's Walk a Mile in my shoes over at Pioneer Park that starts at 1 o'clock. So lots going on in the community for sure. It's also Economic Development Week. We've had a number of activities this week, and I had a very nice meeting just a few hours ago up at the university with our Association of Defense Communities folks that have been in town all week. Did a presentation at the Chamber of Commerce on Tuesday and helped us look for opportunities where we can bring the university, the community, and the military together and build bridges that are mutually beneficial for all of us. And I think there's a lot of opportunities when you look at the expertise up at the university and just the economic impact of the military in this community is huge. So hopefully we can pursue more of that. There were some ideas put on the table that we're going to put a little energy in pursuing too as we go forward. And lastly on my list here, you probably remember from our DEC and EPA presentations in the community, we've got a lot of work to do as far as a new SIP plan for serious non-attainment. And one of the recommendations is that a stakeholders group be organized in our community to take a look at possibilities for what we can do with air quality and how we can respond to some of the suggestions coming from the EPA. And I was real happy to see FEDCO stepped up, Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation. They're coordinating the stakeholders group, and a bunch of folks have already jumped on the bandwagon, and they're looking for more, but the group that's putting this together and contributing to it includes the Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce, the North Pole Community Chamber of Commerce, the City of Fairbanks, the City of North Pole, Explore Fairbanks, and the Downtown Association. So a press release went out today from FEDCO on there's multiple ways that folks, if they're interested in being part of the stakeholders group, they need to fill out an application. And look for the press releases. There's so much information about the program that I can't really explain it all tonight. But you can get applications at FEDCO or here at our office, the mayor's office here at the borough, and also at our air quality department over on Pegger Road. With that, I'll take any questions if anyone has any.
Any questions for the mayor? Seeing none, it was very thorough, apparently. Thank you. So, let's see, as previously noted, we have a special assembly meeting at 6 o'clock next week, May 17th. Put it on your calendar, please. And May 30th, the Assembly Capital Projects and Legislative Priorities Committee will hold a joint work session with the Fairbanks North Star Borough School Board. I presume we'll have more information about location and time. It's here at 6 o'clock. So May 30th, 6 p.m. in Chambers if you want to participate or observe. And I guess my only comments would be, it's been a long process. I want to thank everybody that came down and testified, sent emails, talked to us, participated. I think we crafted a good budget. It was a hard one. I think there's a lot of difficult decisions that we made. I want to thank the school for working with us. I think that we made a lot of progress both in relationships and in understanding each other's budgets and processes and perspectives. I'm glad we funded Mary Si. I really think that was the right thing to do, and I'm glad we moved the money to the FMR. I think that's another right thing to do. Starts us down the road we need to be on. And I encourage the Solid Waste Department to bring forward an ordinance proposing 5 days so that we can have a discussion with the public about that. Also considering an advisory board as we make these really kind of big system changes to our transfer sites and our solid waste disposal facility. It seems like that might be really useful. Any last comments? We're adjourned.